Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles down for the evening and science is allowed to loosen its collar a little. Tonight, we are stepping back into a world so old, so unfamiliar, and so completely unprepared for what was coming next that it would hardly feel like Earth at all if you stood on it. No birdsong, no shade, no grass underfoot, no forests rustling in the wind. Just bare rock, harsh light, raw coastlines, and continents that looked less like living places and more like construction sites the planet had forgotten to finish. And yet from that empty, stony beginning came one of the most important revolutions in Earth's history, a transformation so thorough that nearly everything we know, from breathable air to rich soils to animals on land, and eventually people building cities and arguing over parking, rests on what happened when the first plants began to move ashore. It is a strangely modest beginning for such a dramatic story. Not armies, not volcanoes, not some giant beast thundering in from the sea, but tiny green pioneers creeping across wet stone and mud, doing what life so often does best, changing the world by simply trying to survive in it. At first glance, plants can seem like the quietest actors in nature. They do not sprint, do not roar, and rarely get cast as the stars of documentaries unless there is a slow zoom and some dramatic music to help them out. But the truth is that plants, and later trees in particular, were among the most powerful geological forces this planet has ever known. They did not merely decorate the land, they reworked it. They pulled carbon from the air, altered the chemistry of the oceans, broke stone into soil, cooled the climate, built habitats, redirected water, and laid the groundwork for entire ecosystems. In a very real sense, forests did not arrive in a ready-made world. They helped make the world that followed. Before we wander into that deep past, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what sort of hour it is in your corner of things. Maybe it is late, and the house has finally gone quiet. Maybe it is raining lightly outside. Maybe you're listening from a city apartment, or a rural road, or under a blanket while the rest of the world insists on remaining far too awake. There is something fitting about thinking about the first forests while surrounded by the small comforts of the modern world, because almost every comfort we know has roots, quite literally, in the long green labour of ancient plants. And if you find this journey soothing, interesting, or simply a nice place to let your thoughts slow down for a while, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed as well. It helps this calm little corner reach other people who might enjoy drifting off somewhere between science and sleep. I do hope the story is restful enough that you begin to nod off somewhere around the rise of the earliest woodlands, though if you do stay awake, at least you will have spent the evening in respectable company, with several 100 million years of planetary history. So, get comfortable. Let the day loosen its grip a bit, and we'll begin where the land was almost empty and the future forests had not yet learned their names. It is easy to forget how alien the continents once were. When we picture ancient Earth, many of us imagine dinosaurs, swamps, giant insects, and dense tropical greenery. But that image belongs to a much later world. If we travel far enough back, before forests, before flowers, before even mossy carpets covered the ground, land was a difficult place to live. The oceans had hosted life for a very long time already. For billions of years, living organisms had evolved in water, where buoyancy held them up, moisture surrounded them, and the chemistry of life could proceed without the constant problem of drying out. On land, none of that help existed. Step out of the sea and suddenly gravity was a more serious matter. Sunlight could be harsher. Temperatures swung more wildly, and dehydration was not an inconvenience but a crisis. The continents themselves were also physically different. Without widespread plant cover, much of Earth's land surface was exposed mineral, broken rock, sediment and barren crust. Rain fell on naked stone. Wind moved loose particles freely. Rivers carried sediments differently. Coastlines shifted under conditions that were less buffered by roots, less anchored by vegetation, and less softened by the kinds of soils we now take for granted. There were no deep forest floors, no leaf litter slowly rotting into humus, no root system stitching hillsides together. The very skin of the planet was thinner, simpler, and in many places harsher. Soil, which sounds so ordinary that we rarely pause to think about it, was not yet the rich, layered, living material it would later become across much of the world. Modern soil is not just crushed rock, it is a collaboration between geology, chemistry, climate, microbes, fungi, roots, water, and time. It is as much a biological creation as a physical one. But before life colonized the land in force, true soils were limited and primitive. Rock weathered, certainly. Rain and temperature changes cracked surfaces, minerals broke down, sediments accumulated, but the complex, dark, nutrient-cycling ground that could support forests, insects, and eventually farms was still mostly in the future. Even the atmosphere, though already transformed long before by photosynthetic microbes in the oceans, was still part of a different planetary system. Carbon dioxide levels were often far higher than those familiar to recent human history. The climate could be warm in ways that modern Earth rarely is. The interaction between air, sea, stone and life had not yet been rewritten by large-scale vegetation on land. Earth was habitable, yes, but not in the way we usually mean when we imagine a welcoming landscape. It was a world where life had mastered the seas far better than it had mastered the continents. And that is one of the remarkable things about this story. Land was not empty because life lacked imagination. It was empty because land posed a very annoying set of engineering problems. To live on shore, early organisms had to solve several issues at once. They had to avoid drying out. They had to support themselves without water holding them up. They had to protect delicate tissues from stronger ultraviolet radiation and fluctuating temperatures. They had to reproduce in a place where sperm could not simply swim from one cell to another through open water with carefree aquatic optimism. They had to gain access to nutrients locked in rock rather than dissolved conveniently around them. It was not impossible, clearly, but it was not straightforward either. For a long while, the sea remained the more sensible address. If Earth had a property market back then, the oceans had much better reviews. Reliable moisture, easier chemistry, plenty of company. The continents, by comparison, were exposed, dry in places, and generally underdeveloped. Beautiful in a raw geological sense, perhaps, but not yet what anyone would call lush. And still, life has a habit of testing boundaries. Shorelines were not hard borders. There were tidal flats, damp margins, river edges, and periodically wet surfaces where organisms could tolerate brief exposure and perhaps gain some advantage by venturing just a little farther than their neighbours. It likely began in these in-between places, the margins where water met land and neither side had full control. That is often how major transitions start in natural history, not with some dramatic leap into a completely new world, but with a slow occupation of borderlands, wet rocks, muddy fringes, estuaries, floodplains, places where an organism could still rely on moisture part of the time, while beginning to experiment with survival beyond permanent submersion. These transitional habitats would have been difficult, but they were also full of opportunity. Less competition, new light conditions, fresh mineral surfaces, and the possibility of exploiting spaces no one had yet fully claimed. When we say the first plants conquered land, it can sound as though they marched in with banners and a military soundtrack. In reality, the process was slower, messier, and much more biological than dramatic, yet the effect was no less profound. Once photosynthetic life established itself on land, even in small and humble forms, the continents ceased to be merely geological surfaces and became active biological landscapes. And once that process began, the planet started changing in ways that were both beneficial and, in the long run, destabilizing enough to tip Earth into major climatic consequences. That is the second half of the story, and it is what makes it so fascinating. The rise of land plants did not simply make Earth greener and nicer, It also helped draw down vast amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That cooling effect, amplified over immense stretches of time, likely played a major role in reshaping climate and may have contributed to severe glaciations. In other words, the early spread of vegetation did not just create habitable land. It may also have helped push Earth toward environmental upheaval on a planetary scale. The first trees, in doing their slow green work, were not only builders, they were also disruptors. There is something very modern about that lesson. We often think of environmental change as something animals do badly and plants quietly endure. But plants have always been agents of change. Forests regulate water cycles, alter rainfall, affect erosion, store carbon, influence temperature, generate habitats, and modify atmospheric chemistry. Remove enough forest, and entire systems wobble. Add forest to a previously barren world, and those systems can be remade from the ground up. Trees are not scenery. They are infrastructure. They are not simply passengers on the planet. They are among its engineers. That may sound like a dramatic statement, but once you begin noticing what forests actually do, it becomes hard to see them any other way. A forest captures sunlight and turns air into tissue. It lifts water from the ground and releases it back into the sky. It slows wind at the surface, shelters animals, feeds fungi and microbes, builds and protects soil, affects local humidity, and over time changes the chemistry of what lies beneath and above it. Stretch that influence across continents and across millions of years, and you no longer have mere patches of greenery. You have a force capable of altering the trajectory of Earth history. Still, none of that was obvious at the start. The first land plants were not towering trees. They were small, low to the ground, and by modern standards rather simple. If you could visit some of those earliest landscapes after life had just begun to establish itself on land, you would not find shady canopies and fern-filled paths. You would see something subtler, thin coverings of green, damp mats, primitive plant forms hugging the surface. Perhaps a scene more like a modest biological experiment than a triumphant forest takeover. Yet in these early arrivals lay the beginnings of almost everything that followed. It helps perhaps to think of the process less like decorating a room and more like rewiring a house while living in it. The first land plants did not arrive on a stable system and simply take up residence. Their presence fed back into the system itself. By growing, dying, spreading and interacting with minerals and microbes, they began to change the chemistry of weathering. They helped break rock down more effectively. They increased the movement of nutrients. They trapped sediments. They contributed organic matter. The result was a gradual but fundamental shift in how the land functioned. Surfaces that had once been mostly mineral began to acquire a biological layer. The continents started becoming fertile. And fertility changes everything. Once land can hold moisture better, cycle nutrients more effectively, and support thicker growth, other forms of life can move in. Microbial communities become more complex. Fungi form partnerships. Arthropods find niches. Later, animals begin venturing farther from water. What was once a difficult and exposed environment becomes patchier, softer, and more structurally varied. Shade appears, shelter appears, food webs develop. The land stops being merely where the rock is and becomes a place where ecosystems can happen. Of course, this all took an astonishingly long time, far beyond ordinary human intuition. We're used to thinking in years, perhaps centuries if we're feeling historical. But Earth's major transformations unfold over spans so vast that even whole civilizations would vanish inside them like brief weather. The colonization of land by plants was not an event in the everyday sense. It was a deep transition, measured in millions upon millions of years, involving many stages, many dead ends, and many experiments in form and function. Some lineages prospered, others did not. Some innovations changed everything. Others remained local curiosities in evolution's workshop. That slow pace can make the story harder to feel, but it also makes it more impressive. Every forest on Earth today, from boreal stands in the north to tropical rainforests near the equator, descends from that long problem-solving history. Every root gripping soil, every leaf drawing carbon from the air, every fallen branch feeding fungi on a damp forest floor belongs to a lineage of solutions worked out over deep time. Even the ordinary tree by a roadside or the weeds pushing through a crack in the pavement carry the legacy of those first attempts to live on bare land. There is also a humbling detail here. Human civilization likes to think of itself as technologically impressive, and to be fair, we have made coffee machines, bridges and heated blankets, which is not nothing. But forests solved a far greater engineering challenge long before we arrived. They learned how to build living towers from sunlight, rock-derived nutrients and thin air. They learned how to anchor landscapes, regulate water, and transform atmospheric chemistry without requiring planning permission, financial markets, or a lengthy online meeting. They simply evolved, spread, and in doing so changed the conditions of life for every creature that followed. That is why the story of the first trees is not just a botanical curiosity, it is a planetary story. The land we live on, farm on, pave over, and occasionally attempt to landscape with more confidence than skill was made by these ancient biological revolutions. When we talk about protecting forests today, it is not merely a matter of saving attractive places full of birds and moss, and those roots that always seem determined to trip hikers at the exact wrong moment. It is about maintaining systems that help stabilize climate, water, soils, and biodiversity. Forests helped build the habitable Earth. Damaging them at scale is not like removing wallpaper. It is more like quietly taking apart the life support systems in a house and hoping the windows will handle it. But that modern warning belongs a little later in the journey. For now, it is enough to picture the Earth before the Great Green Transformation had fully begun. A stony world, a quieter shoreline, continents not yet softened by the long patience of roots. No deep woods, no rustle of leaves, no thick scent of damp soil after rain. Just the raw surface of a planet waiting. Though of course it was not really waiting, because planets do not wait and evolution does not plan. Yet in retrospect, the stage was set for one of the most consequential expansions life would ever make. Somewhere along those early coasts and wet margins, life began pressing outward. The first green films and simple plants did not know they were preparing the way for forests, animals, birds, mammals, or us. They were not trying to cool the planet or draw down carbon or invent soil. They were only surviving, expanding, reproducing, and taking advantage of new opportunities one incremental adaptation at a time. But that is often how the largest changes begin, not with intention, but with accumulation. A small shift repeated long enough becomes a world, and once those first green footholds took hold on rock and mud, nothing about the continents would remain quite the same. At first, the move onto land did not look impressive. If you had somehow stood on an early shoreline waiting for the grand arrival of terrestrial life, you would probably have been disappointed. No towering trunks, no fern canopies, no mossy glades, not even the comforting sight of a small bush doing its best. The first green presence on land was likely low, patchy, damp, and easy to miss. It would have clung to mud, spread across wet rock, and gathered in places where water lingered just long enough to make survival possible. It was not the sort of entrance that announces itself with confidence. It was more like a cautious test, a biological toe dipped onto the continents to see whether the whole arrangement was worth the trouble. That modest beginning is part of what makes it so important. So much of Earth's later history depended on something that, at first, would have looked barely more ambitious than a stain on stone. Yet those first green footholds marked the start of one of the largest environmental shifts the planet had ever seen. Once photosynthetic organisms established themselves on land, even in simple forms, the continents stopped being passive surfaces shaped only by wind, rain, rivers, and tectonics. They became places where life could start pushing back, holding on, altering chemistry, and slowly rewriting the rules. To understand those first steps, it helps to remember where plants came from. Their ancestors were aquatic. Long before anything green covered the continents, photosynthetic life had already transformed the seas. Among the most important ancestors of land plants were green algae, especially a lineage of freshwater forms that shared key traits with the plants that would later spread across the land. These organisms were not trees in waiting, not tiny saplings with big dreams, but they already had some of the biochemical tools that would matter later. They carried chlorophyll, stored energy in familiar ways, and built their cell walls from cellulose. In other words, they belonged to a family line that was already good at making a living from sunlight. Freshwater habitats were likely crucial in this story. The leap from open ocean to dry land would have been a bit like going from a swimming pool to a desert parking lot with no hat. Freshwater margins, by contrast, offered more gradual transitions. Ponds, riverbanks, floodplains, and damp shorelines created unstable but promising environments, places where organisms could experience periodic drying, shifting water levels, and exposed surfaces without being completely abandoned by moisture. Natural selection tends to work well in these awkward in-between zones. Life experiments there because the risks are manageable and the rewards can be large. At some point, probably through many small transitions rather than one dramatic breakthrough, certain algae-like ancestors became better at surviving brief exposure to air. Perhaps they tolerated drying a little longer. Perhaps they held onto moisture more effectively. Perhaps they reproduced in ways that did not require complete submersion every moment of the day. We do not have a perfect film reel of these first attempts, only scattered evidence, later descendants, and the patient detective work of paleobotanists who spend a great deal of time looking at ancient fragments and trying to reconstruct lost worlds from what is, frankly, an unreasonable number of spores. And spores matter more than they might sound. When people imagine fossils, they often think of bones, shells, teeth, and impressive skeletons posed in museums as though extinction was simply an excuse for better lighting. But the earliest land plants were soft, small, and not especially cooperative from a fossilization standpoint. They did not leave sturdy trunks early on. Much of the evidence for their existence comes from microscopic remains, especially spores with protective walls that could survive long enough to be preserved in ancient sediments. These tiny traces tell us that land plants, or at least plant-like organisms closely related to them, were present earlier than the larger body fossils might suggest. That is one of the quietly thrilling things about early life on land. The visible world may have looked almost empty for a long time, but the sediments tell a different story. By the Ordovician period, more than 450 million years ago, there is evidence in the form of cryptospores that suggests embryophyte-like plants had already begun making inroads onto land. They were not forests, not even close, but they were there. Small, low, reproducing, persisting. A green beginning, almost hidden from view but very real. If you could walk through one of those early vegetated landscapes, you might first wonder whether you'd arrived too soon. The ground would not resemble a modern meadow or woodland. It may have looked more like a set of damp surfaces interrupted by green coatings and little upright structures only a few centimetres tall. Think less countryside stroll and more biological prototype. There may have been crusts, mats, and tiny plant bodies hugging the substrate, taking advantage of moisture after rain or beside streams. Some would have resembled modern liverworts, or moss-like forms in their general simplicity, though not necessarily as direct copies. The point is not that the first land plants looked exactly like modern bryophytes, but that they were likely small, non-woody, and closely tied to wet conditions. This would still have been enough to begin changing the land. Even a thin film of life can alter a rock surface. Microbes and early plant communities can trap particles, hold moisture, release organic compounds, and affect how minerals weather. That may not sound dramatic until you remember that the pre-vegetated continents had far less of this kind of biological activity at the surface. Bare rock responds to rain one way. Rock with living organisms on it responds another way entirely. Add enough time and those differences become large. There is also the matter of competition, or rather the surprising lack of it. On land, early plants were moving into a place that was not yet crowded with complex life. There were no grazing mammals, no lumbering herbivores, no swarms of leaf-eating insects stripping everything in sight. There were hardly even proper leaves to eat at first. The dangers were more physical than biological. Drying out, toppling over, failing to reproduce, getting cooked in the sun, or simply not extracting enough nutrients from the substrate. The early continents were difficult, but they were not busy. For the first successful colonizers, that relative emptiness was an opportunity. The margins were probably the first strongholds. Picture wet stone near streams, muddy edges of shallow water, low flats that were sometimes submerged and sometimes exposed. These environments offered enough moisture for delicate tissues while still allowing new experiments in terrestrial living. Over time, the patches of life could expand from these wet edges into slightly drier ground. Not far at first, and not quickly, but enough to matter. Each generation that survived a little better in less water pushed the boundary outward. One reason this happened at all is that land offered useful resources. Sunlight on land was not filtered by water to the same extent as in aquatic environments. Carbon dioxide could be accessed from the air. Mineral surfaces were fresh and in time chemically exploitable. There were simply opportunities available to organisms that could tolerate the inconvenience of being out of water. And nature, when presented with inconvenience plus opportunity, has a habit of inventing solutions. Still, these first green settlers were not independent in the modern sense. They almost certainly remained strongly tied to moisture, not just for daily survival, but for reproduction. Many early plants likely relied on swimming sperm, which meant liquid water still played a direct role in completing the life cycle. This makes their expansion onto land feel a little less like a clean break, and more like a gradual extension of the wet world outward. They were on land, yes, but not yet entirely of it. They were still negotiating terms with the environment. That half-dependent existence helps explain why the first terrestrial plant communities were concentrated where dampness was predictable. Rain-soaked surfaces, stream banks, periodically wet depressions, and coastal settings would have been among the best options. These places also experienced disturbance, which can be surprisingly useful. Floods, shifting sediments, and exposed new surfaces constantly created fresh ground. Early plants did not need to invade old, densely occupied ecosystems because none existed yet. They were pioneers in the literal ecological sense, moving into newly available terrain again and again. As they spread, the look of the continents would have changed in subtle increments. A world that had once been mostly grey, brown and mineral began showing flecks and patches of green. Some surfaces darkened as biological films accumulated. Moisture lingered a bit longer in certain spots. Sediment settled differently where life helped trap it. These changes did not make for a postcard-ready landscape just yet, but they marked a shift in planetary function. The continents were beginning to host persistent photosynthesis. That matters because persistent photosynthesis on land does more than add colour. It changes the carbon cycle. Plants take in carbon dioxide and turn it into biomass. When they die, some of that carbon returns quickly to the atmosphere, but some becomes tied up in soils, sediments, and longer-term geochemical pathways. Even the earliest land plants, modest though they were, would have started participating in this process. At first, the effect may have been limited, but once vegetation spread and ground cover became more extensive, the consequences began building. Slowly, quietly, and with no need for a press release, the atmosphere started dealing with a new kind of partner. It is sometimes tempting to imagine evolution as an orderly progression towards success, as if early plants had a plan, then upgraded step by step until trees appeared and everyone congratulated one another. The reality was less tidy. Early terrestrial life was experimental. Different lineages tried different strategies. Some prospered in damp niches and went no further. Some evolved structures that helped them stand a little taller. Some altered how they moved water internally. Some developed more durable tissues. Many forms appeared and disappeared. The land itself was a testing ground, and the first green expansion was less a straight path than a thicket of possibilities. Even so, there is a broad pattern we can see. Small, simple plant bodies established a foothold first. They covered surfaces, survived in moist places, and reproduced with difficulty but sufficient success. Over time, these forms became more diverse and more terrestrial in habit. Their presence encouraged new interactions with fungi and microbes, changed mineral weathering, and contributed organic matter to the surface. In effect, they were preparing the ground not just physically, but biologically for everything that would come later. That preparation is easy to underestimate because we are used to thinking big things cause big changes. Mountains lift, volcanoes erupt, ice sheets grind. Surely those are the real planetary actors, and of course they are important. But life, especially in persistent and widespread forms, can be just as transformative. A thin green coating spread across enough land for long enough can alter water movement, chemistry, and the availability of nutrients. Life does not need spectacle to be powerful. It only needs reach and time. There was probably something uneven about the spread as well. Not every continent or region would have greened at the same pace. Climate, rock type, latitude, water availability, and local geography all mattered. Some areas would have remained mostly barren for longer. Others may have supported richer early communities. Expansion was not a smooth advancing line like ink moving across a map. It was patchy, opportunistic, and dependent on conditions. One valley might host damp green films and primitive plants, while nearby exposed uplands remained stubbornly empty. And yet even patchiness can matter at scale. Once these communities existed, they influenced the environments around them. They captured dust and particles. They shaded surfaces a little. They provided microhabitats for microbes and tiny organisms. They held water long enough for new cycles of chemical reaction. The bare continents were starting to acquire texture in the ecological sense, not just the geological one. Life was not merely arriving on land. It was beginning to create land as a living environment. This would eventually have consequences for other organisms too. Fungi almost certainly played major roles from early on, likely forming partnerships that helped plants access nutrients from mineral substrates. Microbial communities would have become more layered and diverse in vegetated zones. Small arthropods may have begun exploiting these habitats, feeding on detritus, microbes, or the plants themselves once there was enough plant matter to make such lifestyles worthwhile. The first green steps on stone were not only about plants. They opened doors for networks of life that could not exist until the surface itself became biologically active. It is also worth pausing over how strange these early landscapes must have looked to modern eyes. No birds overhead, no flowering plants, no grass, no shade from trees, no rich smell of woodland decay. If there was movement, it would have been limited and small. Wind over open ground, water slipping through channels, perhaps tiny arthropods in certain places. The silence of such a world is hard to imagine, and yet, from a planetary perspective, it was already becoming busier. Chemistry was shifting, surfaces were softening, the continents were beginning to support life in place rather than merely receiving the occasional wash of it from water. For all their small size, the first land plants were making a bold claim. They were saying, in the only language evolution recognizes, that land could be inhabited. Not comfortably yet, not widely, and certainly not with anything as grand as a forest, but inhabited nonetheless. That was enough. Once a lineage proves something is possible, evolution can get to work refining it. And refinement, given millions of years, is how damp green films eventually turn into woodlands, root systems, and towering canopies. There is a certain dry humour in this if you think about it. The first phase of conquering the continents was essentially to become very good at being small and slightly damp. No trumpet fanfare, no majestic entrance, just low-growing persistence. But that is often how Earth changes, not with neat milestones anyone present could appreciate, but with long stretches of quiet accumulation. A little more cover here, a little better survival there, a little more organic matter mixed into mineral grains, enough generations, enough spread, enough chemical persistence, and one day the planet is no longer what it was. By the late Silurian and into the Devonian, the evidence becomes more visible. Plant fossils show increasing complexity. Upright stems appear. Vascular tissues begin to matter. The land flora becomes harder to overlook. But before that more recognizable world arrives, there is this first stage, easy to miss unless you know where to look, where life begins coating, gripping, and quietly occupying the raw surface of a rocky planet. And that is perhaps the best way to picture it for now. Not a sudden greening of all continents at once, but the first lasting traces of life beyond the waterline. Thin footholds on wet stone, small bodies hugging the ground, spores carried into new terrain, a shoreline no longer entirely bare. From there, the next challenge was not simply to arrive on land, but to remain there more reliably, to solve the many practical problems that came with air, gravity, sunlight, and dryness, and to turn a cautious foothold into a permanent way of life. Stepping onto land was one thing, staying there was the harder part. A few damp green pioneers could cling to wet surfaces and survive near the edges of water, but if plants were going to spread farther, persist longer, and stop behaving like nervous guests who might rush back to the shoreline at the first sign of inconvenience, they needed solutions. Land was bright, open, dry in all the wrong moments, poor in easily available nutrients, and entirely lacking the kind of buoyant support that water had provided for their ancestors for ages. On land, nothing held you up, nothing reliably kept you moist, and reproduction suddenly became an elaborate administrative challenge. So the story of plants learning to survive on land is really the story of a long series of biological inventions, each one solving a problem that did not exist in quite the same way in the water. It is worth remembering how complete that challenge was. In water, a photosynthetic organism is surrounded by the medium in which life first evolved. Water supports tissues, it carries dissolved nutrients, it allows sperm cells to swim, it softens temperature swings, it reduces the immediate danger of drying out, which on land is less a minor inconvenience and more a full-scale emergency. In air, by contrast, tissues lose water quickly. Gravity has more to say about posture. Sunlight can be intense. Wind can damage exposed cells. And the whole business of moving water and nutrients from one part of the body to another becomes a much more serious engineering problem when you are no longer floating in a convenient solution. So plants did not simply arrive on land and start thriving by force of personality. They had to evolve structures and strategies that made terrestrial life workable. Some of those changes were subtle, some were transformative. All of them, in one way or another, helped life do something that had once seemed improbable. Build a stable existence on dry ground. One of the first and most obvious problems was water loss. A soft-bodied organism exposed to air risks drying out rapidly. Cells need water to function. Their chemistry depends on it. Membranes rely on it. Photosynthesis relies on it. So a plant body sitting in the open without protection is in danger from the moment it leaves a wet surface. One of the most important innovations in early land plants was the development of a cuticle, a waxy outer coating that helped reduce water loss from exposed tissues. This may not sound dramatic, but it was crucial. A cuticle is essentially the botanical version of learning that if the world insists on being dry, you had better stop leaking. The cuticle was not a perfect solution. In fact, it introduced a new problem almost immediately. If a plant seals itself too well against water loss, It also makes it harder for carbon dioxide to enter for photosynthesis. Plants need to take in carbon dioxide from the air, but the more open their surfaces are, the more water they lose. This created a trade-off that plants had to manage very carefully. Their answer was one of the small masterpieces of biological design, stomata. Stomata are tiny adjustable pores, usually found on plant surfaces, that allow gases to move in and out while helping regulate water loss. They can open to let carbon dioxide in and close to conserve moisture. In effect, they are microscopic valves, allowing a plant to negotiate with the atmosphere rather than simply surrender to it. With stomata, plants could begin functioning in air with far greater control. They no longer had to choose between complete exposure and complete isolation. They could respond. They could manage exchange. They could, in a quiet and very plant-like way, become more sophisticated about breathing. That said, stomata are only useful if the rest of the plant can handle what follows. Once carbon dioxide enters and photosynthesis proceeds, the plant must keep its tissues hydrated and supplied with nutrients. This is not a trivial matter when living on land. Early low-growing plants could get by through diffusion over short distances and by staying small and close to moist surfaces. But as lineages diversified, and some began growing taller or spreading farther from consistently wet ground, new internal transport systems became necessary. This is where vascular tissue enters the story, and it is difficult to overstate how important that was. Vascular tissues, especially xylem and phloem, allowed plants to transport water, minerals, and sugars more efficiently through their bodies. Xylem carries water and dissolved nutrients upward from the substrate. Phloem transports sugars and other products of photosynthesis to where they are needed. Once plants had these internal highways, they were no longer limited to the sort of small, flat, moisture-dependent forms that hug the ground out of necessity. They could begin building larger bodies. They could elevate photosynthetic structures. They could occupy space vertically, which would eventually change ecosystems beyond recognition. Of course, moving water upward is one thing. Remaining upright long enough to benefit from it is another. Water had once helped support plant ancestors by simple buoyancy. Land offered no such kindness. If you want to rise above the ground, reach more light, and avoid being merely a green suggestion on a wet stone, you need structural strength. Plants gradually evolved stronger cell walls and supportive tissues, including the eventual development of lignin, a complex polymer that stiffened cell walls and helped make upright growth possible. Lignin would later become central to wood, and wood would later become central to trees, forests, habitat structure, carbon storage, and eventually furniture assembly instructions that no one fully enjoys. But long before any of that, strengthening tissues meant freedom from the ground. Even before full woody growth appeared, increased support allowed plants to stand a little taller, hold spore-producing structures higher, and compete more effectively for light. Height matters. On land, where sunlight comes from above and can be blocked by neighbours, being able to raise your photosynthetic surfaces even slightly can be an advantage. Once some plants began doing this, others would follow, and the land slowly shifted from low biological films to increasingly structured vegetation. Still, water and support were only part of the challenge. Reproduction on land may have been even trickier. Aquatic ancestors could rely on water to bring gametes together, but on land, if sperm still need a film of water to swim, then reproduction remains tied to wet conditions. Many early land plants did indeed retain this dependence. Even today, mosses and ferns still require water for sperm to reach eggs. But early terrestrial plants also evolved protective reproductive structures that made life on land more manageable. One of the defining traits of land plants is the retention and protection of the embryo. Rather than immediately releasing delicate developing stages into the environment, land plants keep the embryo sheltered within parental tissue for a time. This is one reason they are called embryophytes. It is an elegant adaptation because land is a dangerous place for vulnerable cells. Exposure, drying, and mechanical stress can all ruin the effort before it begins. By protecting the embryo, plants gave their offspring a better start. Spores also became more robust. Early land plant spores had resistant outer walls made of compounds such as sporopollenin, which is famous among botanists for being extremely durable, and perhaps among everyone else for being something they rarely discuss over dinner. But its importance is enormous. A tough spore wall helps resist desiccation and damage, allowing reproductive cells to survive transport through air and endure harsher conditions than unprotected cells could manage. This made dispersal on land more practical. Wind could carry spores, new areas could be colonized, and the life cycle became less vulnerable to every passing dry spell. This did not mean early plants were suddenly liberated from moisture altogether. Far from it. For a long time, many still depended on wet conditions at key moments, but the combination of protected embryos, durable spores, and better control over water loss made terrestrial living less precarious. Plants were moving step by step from temporary occupation to true establishment. There was also the issue of nutrient acquisition. In water, nutrients may be dissolved around you. On land, many essential nutrients are locked within rock or scattered thinly through early substrates. If you are a small plant trying to grow on mineral surfaces, this becomes a problem quite quickly. The solution was not purely anatomical, it was ecological. Plants formed partnerships with fungi. These associations, known today as mycorrhizal relationships in many modern plants, are ancient and likely critical to the success of early land colonization. Fungi are excellent explorers of tiny spaces. Their filamentous bodies can penetrate substrates, release compounds that help weather minerals, and absorb nutrients that would otherwise remain difficult for plants to access. In exchange, plants provide sugars made by photosynthesis. It is one of the oldest and most successful partnerships on Earth. Plants brought energy from sunlight. Fungi brought access to the mineral world. Together, they did much more than either could have done alone. This partnership may have been especially important in the earliest phases of life on land because true soils were not yet widespread or well developed. The first terrestrial plants were not stepping into rich ground, they were helping create it. Fungi would have made that effort far more effective, extending nutrient uptake and allowing early plants to gain footholds in places where bare chemistry alone might not have been enough. It is one of those reminders that life does not always conquer by competition alone. Quite often it does so by cooperation, though usually on terms so practical that no one involved would call it sentimental. As plants spread and diversified, their bodies also became more specialised. Instead of simply being all-purpose green tissue, different parts began taking on distinct roles. Some tissues became better at photosynthesis, some better at support, some better at conducting water, some better at reproduction. This division of labour is a common path toward complexity and evolution. Once a body plan allows different regions to do different jobs, performance improves. Plants can become larger, more efficient and more adaptable. Leaves, in the broad sense, would later become a major part of this story. But early plant surfaces were often simpler. Even so, the gradual evolution of expanded photosynthetic structures increased light capture and productivity. Similarly, rooting structures became more effective. The earliest land plants may not have had true roots in the modern sense. Many probably used rhizoids, simple hair-like structures that helped anchor them and perhaps aided in limited absorption. But as plants became more complex, true roots evolved in several lineages, giving them far better access to water and nutrients, and allowing them to anchor more substantial bodies in the ground. This transition from rhizoids to more complex rooting systems had large consequences. A rooted plant can stabilise itself better, explore a greater volume of substrate, and tolerate more challenging surface conditions. Roots also physically and chemically alter the ground around them. They wedge into cracks, promote weathering, release compounds, and create channels for water movement. Once roots became widespread, plants were no longer simply sitting on the land, they were entering it. That change in relationship with the ground was one of the turning points in Earth history. Before roots and root-like systems became common, the surface of the continents was much more directly exposed to erosion and runoff. Once plants began anchoring themselves more deeply and more effectively, they changed how sediments moved, how water infiltrated, and how rock broke down. The land started behaving differently because plants had learned not merely to survive on it, but to physically engage with it. There was another challenge too, one we do not often think about because modern plants make it look routine. Temperature on land is more variable than in water. Surfaces can heat quickly in sunlight and cool rapidly at night. Exposure to ultraviolet radiation is also greater. Early terrestrial plants needed ways to tolerate these stresses. Protective pigments, tougher outer tissues, and life cycles synchronized with favorable moisture and temperature conditions would all have helped. Some likely survived desiccation better than others. Some probably lived quickly and reproduced in windows of good conditions. Some remained tied to sheltered environments where extremes were less severe. In other words, early land plants did not solve the land problem once and for all. They solved parts of it well enough in enough places to keep expanding. That distinction matters. Evolution rarely produces perfection. It produces workable compromises. A plant that loses less water but still needs wet conditions for reproduction is a workable compromise. A plant with better support but limited height is a workable compromise. A plant that partners with fungi to get nutrients rather than evolving some solitary miracle of extraction is a workable compromise. And over millions of years, those compromises accumulated into a terrestrial flora that became harder and harder to dislodge. This gradual success also reshaped selective pressures. As plants spread, they created more shade, more humidity close to the ground, more organic matter, and more competition with one another. The very presence of plants altered the environment in ways that encouraged new adaptations. Once the land was no longer mostly bare, being a small, simple organism hugging wet stone was no longer the only game in town. Different strategies became possible. Some plants could invest in height, others in branching, others in faster reproduction or wider spore dispersal. The colonization of land created new ecological space, and plants themselves were the ones building it. There is something almost architectural about this. Plants were solving their own engineering problems while simultaneously constructing the conditions that would make future solutions easier. A thin cuticle allowed survival in drier air. Stomata made gas exchange manageable. Vascular tissues moved resources. Support tissues allowed height. Protective embryos and spores improved reproduction. Fungal partnerships solved nutrient access. Rooting structures stabilized bodies and reworked the substrate. No single innovation made terrestrial dominance inevitable, but together they transformed possibility into permanence. By the time these features became widespread across plant lineages, the continents were no longer merely places plants could visit. They were places plants could inhabit, reshape, and diversify within. That is a major difference. An occasional green film on damp rock is a beginning. A world in which plant life can persist across broad environments, reproduce successfully, alter the substrate, and create conditions for further expansion is something else entirely. It is the start of a planetary transition. This was also the stage at which other branches of life could begin exploiting the terrestrial opportunity more seriously. Once plant communities became more stable and productive, they offered food, shelter, humidity, and structure. Small arthropods could graze or scavenge. Microbial communities could become richer. Fungi could proliferate. What had once been a hard mineral surface with occasional biological traces was turning into habitat. Not grand forest habitat yet, but habitat all the same. There is a tendency, especially when telling deep history, to focus on the large visible milestones. The first forests, the first trees, the first animals walking about with enough confidence to leave notable footprints. But before any of that, there had to be this long period of practical problem solving. Plants had to learn how not to dry out, how to exchange gases without collapsing into crispy disappointment, how to hold themselves upright, how to move water internally, how to reproduce in a world that no longer provided a free swimming pool for gametes, and how to get nutrients from stubborn rock and infant soils. That list alone should earn them a certain respect, and the solutions were good enough not only to work but to spread. Once land plants possessed the necessary toolkit in broad outline, they began moving farther from the wet margins that had first sheltered them. Not everywhere at once, not with perfect independence from moisture, but with increasing confidence. Low vegetation expanded, upright stems became more common, the land surface accumulated more organic matter. The ground itself began changing in texture, chemistry, and biological complexity. In time, this would prepare the way for roots to go deeper, stems to rise higher, and eventually the first true trees to alter the atmosphere and climate on a planetary scale. For now, though, it is enough to see the achievement clearly. Plants learn to survive on land by evolving a set of practical answers to a difficult environment. They did not do it in a single leap, and they did not do it alone. They partnered with fungi, experimented with body plans, and slowly assembled the structures that made air, rock, and sunlight into a workable home. Once those answers were in place, the bare continents stopped being merely available and started becoming livable, and from there the next change was not simply more plants, but the gradual invention of the very ground beneath them. Once plants had learned the basic tricks of surviving on land, keeping water in, taking carbon dioxide in without losing too much moisture, protecting embryos, and holding themselves upright for at least a modest little existence, a new problem came into focus. It was not enough to sit on the land. To truly change the land, plants had to get into it. That meant finding water below the surface, securing nutrients that were not drifting conveniently by in a surrounding medium, and anchoring themselves against wind, rain, and the occasional geological inconvenience. In other words, the next great step in turning bare continents into living landscapes was not above ground at all. It happened below our feet. This is where roots, fungi, and soil enter the story, and together they form one of the most important partnerships in the history of the planet. It is also one of the least glamorous at first glance. Leaves and trunks tend to get the attention. Forest canopies look impressive. Even flowers, much later on, managed a rather successful public relations campaign, but roots and fungi are the quiet workers in the background, doing slow, chemically sophisticated, physically transformative labour in the dark. If trees are the visible architecture of the land, roots and fungi are the engineers, plumbers, demolition crew, and civil contractors all rolled into one. And soil, the thing they helped create, is less a simple material than a living system built over immense spans of time. Before this process got underway in earnest, much of the land surface was still a difficult place for life to hold. There were weathered minerals, loose sediments, cracked rock, and patches of organic matter from early plant life, but not the thick, structured, biologically active soils that we know today. Modern soil is not just powdered rock, it is a layered mixture of mineral particles, decaying organic matter, water, air, microbes, fungi, plant roots, and small animals, all interacting continuously. It stores nutrients, regulates moisture, buffers temperature, supports plants, and hosts astonishing numbers of living organisms. In a teaspoon of healthy soil, there can be more microbes than there are people in many towns, which is impressive, though fortunately they are less likely to complain about parking. That kind of soil did not appear all at once, it had to be built. Or perhaps invented is the better word, because early life on land did not simply find rich ground waiting for it. It gradually transformed mineral surfaces into something biologically active and increasingly complex. The first land plants had already started this process in a small way by trapping particles, adding organic material, and encouraging microbial activity. But with the evolution of more effective rooting systems and deeper partnerships with fungi, the pace and scale of change increased dramatically. Roots were a major part of that change, though the earliest land plants did not begin with roots in the full modern sense. Many early forms had rhizoids, Simple structures that helped them anchor themselves and may have played some role in water uptake. Rhizoids were useful, but they were limited. They were not yet the branching, penetrating, highly specialised organs that later plants would use to explore soil and rock in 3 dimensions. True roots changed the relationship between plants and the land because they allowed plants not merely to sit on the surface, but to invade it. A root does several things at once. It anchors the plant, which is helpful if one intends to remain upright instead of rolling off in a strong rain. It takes up water. It absorbs nutrients such as phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen compounds, and trace elements. It branches through the substrate, increasing contact with mineral surfaces. It creates tiny channels that alter how water moves underground. It releases compounds into the surrounding environment. And, importantly for the long transformation of the continents, it helps break down rock and sediment both physically and chemically. Physical weathering by roots can be quite straightforward. A root grows into a crack, expands, and exerts pressure. Over time, that crack widens. Repeated growth, hydration changes, freeze-thaw cycles in some climates, and the general persistence of living tissue in inconvenient places can gradually pry rock apart. Anyone who has looked at a pavement slab being slowly defeated by a tree root has seen a small modern example of the principle. Scale that up over millions of years and across entire landscapes, and roots become a geological force. Chemical weathering is even more important. Roots and their associated microbes release organic acids and other compounds into the substrate, altering the chemistry around mineral grains. This helps dissolve and free nutrients that would otherwise remain locked in rock. Fresh mineral surfaces react with water and carbon dioxide, and biological activity speeds and directs many of these reactions. The result is that rock does not simply erode. It becomes altered, transformed, and incorporated into the beginnings of soil. Plants did not accomplish this alone, and in many cases probably could not have. Fungi were essential partners. The relationship between plant roots and fungi is one of the great success stories in biology. Ancient, widespread, and remarkably effective. In mycorrhizal associations, fungi connect with plant roots and extend fine filaments called hyphae out into the surrounding substrate. These hyphae are far thinner than roots and can explore tiny spaces in soil and rock particles that roots cannot reach. They dramatically increase the effective surface area through which a plant can access water and nutrients. This arrangement is wonderfully practical. The plant, through photosynthesis, produces sugars and other carbon-rich compounds. The fungus, which cannot photosynthesize, receives these as food. In return, the fungus helps gather water and nutrients, particularly phosphorus, from the soil or weathering rock. It is less a sentimental friendship and more an ancient economic agreement, though one with far better long-term stability than many human contracts. Both partners benefit, and together they can colonize environments that would be difficult for either to manage alone. There is strong evidence that such associations are very old, likely dating back to the earlier successful colonization of land by plants. That makes sense. Early terrestrial environments were poor in developed soil, nutrients were patchy, and plants needed every advantage they could get. Fungi, already very good at infiltrating substrates and digesting difficult materials, were natural allies. With fungal help, plants could obtain more nutrients, tolerate harsher conditions, and spread more effectively. With plant help, fungi gained access to a steady source of energy from sunlight captured above ground. It was a powerful combination, and the continents would never quite be the same afterward. As roots and fungi expanded through the ground, they began changing not only the chemistry of weathering, but the structure of the substrate itself. Mineral grains became mixed with organic matter from dead plant tissues, fungal remains, microbial biomass, and decaying surface litter. Water no longer simply rushed over hard, bare surfaces in the same way. More of it infiltrated. Some was retained. Some moved slowly through channels created by roots and soil structure. Sediments became more stable in some places and more deeply altered in others. The surface layer of the earth, once comparatively raw, began developing horizons and internal organisation. That process is what we mean when we talk about the invention of soil. Soil is not invented in the sense that someone sat down with a sketchbook and a set of plans. It is invented in the sense that a new planetary system emerged through interaction. Plants added carbon to the land. Roots broke up substrate and altered water flow. Fungi extracted nutrients and extended the reach of plants. Microbes decomposed organic material and drove chemical cycles. Minerals broke down into finer particles. Organic matter accumulated. Structure developed. Over time, the land acquired a skin that was not purely geological and not purely biological, but something in between and dependent on both. This had enormous consequences. Once soils began developing more widely, they made terrestrial ecosystems more productive. Plants could establish more easily because water and nutrients were retained better. More plants meant more litter and more roots, which meant more organic matter and further soil development. This is one of those feedback loops that Earth history is full of. A little vegetation helps create better substrate. Better substrate supports more vegetation. More vegetation intensifies weathering and organic input. Slowly, landscapes move from sparsely colonized surfaces toward more stable plant communities. It also changed rivers. Before widespread vegetation and developed soils, rainfall running over bare land could produce different patterns of erosion and sediment transport. With roots holding sediment in place and soils absorbing more water, slopes stabilized in new ways. Channels could become more defined. Floodplains began functioning differently. Fine sediments trapped by vegetation and soil processes altered the material carried to lowlands and eventually to the sea. The geometry of rivers, the frequency of certain depositional environments, and the chemistry of runoff all changed as plants and soils spread. The continents were becoming less like exposed mineral platforms and more like regulated landscapes. There is something a bit ironic here. We often think of soil as one of the most ordinary things on Earth. It gets on shoes, under fingernails, and occasionally onto carpets in ways that inspire household negotiations. Yet soil is one of the most complex and consequential products of Earth history. Without it, terrestrial ecosystems as we know them do not function. Agriculture does not happen in anything like its present form. Forests cannot establish the same way. The cycling of water, nutrients and carbon looks entirely different. So the slow creation of soil by roots, fungi, microbes, and decaying plant matter was not a minor side effect of greening the continents. It was one of the central transformations that made later terrestrial life possible. There was another effect as well, and this one reached far beyond local ecology. As roots and fungal partnerships intensified the weathering of silicate rocks, they contributed to the long-term drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The chemistry here unfolds slowly but powerfully. Carbon dioxide dissolves in water to form weak carbonic acid. That acidic water reacts with certain rocks, especially silicates, during weathering. The products of this process are eventually carried by rivers to the oceans, where carbon can be stored in carbonate minerals and sediments over geologic time. Plants and roots accelerate weathering, and by doing so they help move carbon out of the atmosphere and into long-term storage pathways. This matters because atmospheric carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Reduce enough of it over long periods, and climate cools. The spread of land plants, particularly later with deeper roots and more extensive vegetation, likely played a major role in this planetary cooling. What began as a survival strategy for plants, dig deeper, weather more rock, extract more nutrients, ended up altering the atmospheric balance of the planet. This is one reason the history of forests is also the history of climate. Plants do not merely respond to atmospheric conditions, they help create them. Still, in the period we're considering here, the process was gradual. Early rooted systems did not instantly produce rich modern soils across every continent. Development varied by region, climate, rock type, and biological community. Some places likely supported only thin, immature soils for long stretches of time. Others, especially wetter and more stable landscapes, may have seen more rapid accumulation of organic matter and deeper weathering profiles. But even patchy progress mattered, because each area of developing soil became a base for more plant growth and more ecological complexity. This complexity brought in other organisms too. Once soils began forming, they provided habitat for an expanding cast of tiny inhabitants. Bacteria and archaea drove chemical transformations. Fungi spread through organic and mineral matrices. Small arthropods, mites, and other early terrestrial animals could exploit decaying matter, microbial biomass, and the shelter of the ground itself. Soil is, among other things, a city for things too small to demand zoning laws, and as its living population grew, nutrient cycling became more active, decomposition more effective, and plant growth more robust. The relationship between decay and growth is especially important here. Dead plant matter did not simply vanish. It accumulated, decomposed, and became part of the substrate. That made nutrients available again. It contributed carbon-rich compounds to the soil. It improved structure and water-holding capacity. In a very literal sense, the death of early land plants helped make future terrestrial life easier. Forest floors much later would become famous for thick litter and decomposition, but the principle started earlier. Life on land made land more livable by leaving behind useful remains. It is also worth noticing how below-ground complexity makes above-ground complexity possible. A taller plant needs more support and more water. A branching plant with larger photosynthetic surfaces needs more nutrients. A stable plant community needs consistent access to resources below the surface. So before landscapes could host the first true trees, with their greater height, biomass and influence, the underground system had to become more capable. Roots had to reach farther. Fungal networks had to become more effective. Soils had to deepen and organize. The rise of forests was, in many ways, prepared in darkness. There is a tendency in popular imagination to treat the underground part of a plant as secondary, a sort of hidden plumbing attached to the real star of the show above, but that badly understates the matter. The root zone is where plants negotiate with the planet. It is where mineral becomes nutrient, where water is intercepted, where microbes and fungi meet plant chemistry, where structure is built and maintained. Above ground, a plant captures light. Below ground, it secures everything else. Without that exchange, terrestrial life remains small, unstable, and local. Once roots and fungi helped create better soils, the expansion of vegetation could accelerate. Plants could establish farther from constant water margins. They could survive seasonal variation more effectively. They could build more substantial bodies. Communities became denser. The ground became more biologically active. Slopes stabilized. Nutrient cycling intensified. Each of these changes reinforced the others. A landscape with more plants has more litter, more roots, more microbial activity, more water retention, and more substrate development. A landscape with better substrate supports more plants. By this stage, the continents were no longer just being visited by green life, they were being reconstructed by it. The phrase slow invention of soil is useful because it reminds us that this was neither quick nor simple. Soil formation today can still be slow, depending on conditions. In deep time, under early terrestrial circumstances, it unfolded across vast spans, with many local variations and many interacting forces. It involved geology, climate, hydrology, plant evolution, fungal symbiosis, and microbial metabolism all working together. No single actor deserves all the credit. But plants and fungi were central because they linked the atmosphere to the lithosphere in a new way. They brought carbon captured from the air down into the ground and used living tissues to pry open and chemically alter the minerals beneath them. That link between air, life, and rock is one of the fundamental mechanisms by which the Earth system changed. Once land plants began doing this at scale, they altered not only their immediate environment but the chemistry of rivers, the sea, and the atmosphere. Even before forests dominated, the groundwork for planetary transformation was already underway. The continents were softening, the ground was thickening, carbon was moving, water was lingering differently, nutrients were cycling in new patterns. The ancient rocky world was very slowly acquiring the properties of a habitable surface. And from there, the next leap becomes easier to understand. Once the ground could support larger plants, once roots and fungal partnerships had made the land more stable and more fertile, there was room for a more ambitious form of vegetation to appear. Not just low covers and scattered upright stems, but taller bodies, stronger tissues, and the first true attempts to build upward at scale, which is where the story starts changing from green ground cover to something much more recognizable and much more disruptive, the moment the first trees began to rise. For a very long time, life on land stayed low. It spread, adapted, thickened the surface, experimented with stems and spore-bearing structures, and gradually made the continents less hostile and more biologically active. But it did not yet dominate the vertical dimension in any grand way. The world was greener than before, certainly, and more alive than the old barren landscapes had ever been, but it was still a world without true forests in the sense we would recognise. Then, over millions of years, plants began doing something that changed the character of the land completely. They started building upward. This was not just a matter of being taller for the sake of showing off, though evolution does seem to appreciate a good advantage when it finds one. Height solved problems and created opportunities. A taller plant can reach more light. It can spread its spores more widely. It can compete more effectively with neighbouring vegetation. It can support more photosynthetic surface area. And once some plants began rising above the rest, natural selection favoured those that could do it a little better, a little more sturdily, and over time a little more dramatically. The result was one of the great turning points in Earth history, the appearance of the first trees. Now the word tree sounds straightforward, because we live in a world full of them. We think of a trunk, branches, leaves, shade, roots, perhaps a squirrel behaving with unnecessary confidence. But early trees were not all built according to modern expectations. Some of the first tree-like plants belong to lineages that have no exact modern equivalent. Others were related to groups that survive today in reduced or very different forms. So when we talk about the first trees, we're not talking about oak or pine arriving early by several 100 million years and deciding to get a head start on the whole forest business. We're talking about ancient plants that evolved the ability to grow tall, support a substantial body, and maintain themselves as large upright organisms. That ability depended on everything that had come before: cuticles, stomata, vascular tissues, rooting systems, fungal partnerships, and the gradual development of soils had prepared the way. Without internal transport, a plant cannot move enough water to support significant height. Without stronger support tissues, it collapses under its own ambitions. Without roots and the nutrient-gathering systems below ground, larger growth becomes impractical very quickly. So the rise of trees was not an isolated invention. It was the visible outcome of many earlier solutions reaching a new level of integration. By the Devonian period, especially during the Middle and Late Devonian, the continents began to host increasingly complex terrestrial vegetation. Plant forms became larger, more branched and more varied. Some lineages developed woody tissues, allowing substantial vertical growth. Among the early tree-like plants were cladoxylopsids, a rather extraordinary group that included forms like Watiesa. These were not trees in the modern sense of a solid trunk with annual rings and familiar wood anatomy, but they could reach several metres in height and had a distinctly tree-like presence in the landscape. Their crowns were more fern-like or fronded, and their internal structure was unusual compared with later trees, but they stood upright, towered over earlier vegetation, and helped create the first real sense of vertical habitat on land. It is difficult to overstate how significant that must have looked in ecological terms. A world that had long been dominated by low plant cover, mats, small upright stems, and relatively open terrain was beginning to acquire height, shade, layered structure, and new kinds of spatial complexity. Once plants rise into the air, the land ceases to be merely a surface. It becomes volume, and volume changes everything. It creates microclimates. It alters wind at ground level. It changes how sunlight reaches the soil. It produces litter from above rather than only at ground level. It provides perches, shelter, and vertical gradients that later organisms can exploit. Even before animals fully took advantage of such spaces, trees were already inventing new ecological architecture. Another major group in this story were the progymnosperms, especially Archaeopteris, which is often treated as one of the most important early trees. Archaeopteris had a woody trunk, extensive branching, and fern-like foliage. It could reach impressive heights, perhaps up to 20 meters or more in some cases, which would have made it a dominant feature of the Devonian landscape. It also had a deep and extensive root system, and that detail matters enormously. Archaeopteris was not merely tall, it was grounded in a way that allowed it to exert real influence on the land. It anchored slopes, penetrated substrates, and enhanced weathering and soil development on a scale that earlier plants could not match. There is something quietly astonishing about this development. Trees did not simply appear as decorative additions to an already functioning terrestrial system. Their emergence fundamentally changed how that system worked. A tree is not just a large plant, it is a machine for moving water, storing carbon, intercepting sunlight, producing organic matter, and altering the environment around it. Once trees spread, landscapes began to behave differently on almost every level. To grow tall, early trees needed to solve a hydraulic problem that remains central to tree life today. Water has to be drawn from the ground and transported upward through vascular tissue against gravity to leaves or other photosynthetic structures high above the surface. This is no small task. Modern trees rely on the cohesion and tension properties of water, combined with evaporation from leaves, to pull water upward through xylem. Early trees, once they reached significant size, were participating in this same general challenge. Their bodies became columns through which water flowed continuously, linking the soil to the atmosphere. In effect, trees turn the land into part of the planet's water-moving system. That has consequences beyond the tree itself. A stand of trees changes local humidity. It affects evaporation and transpiration. It shades the ground, which alters temperature and moisture conditions below. It slows rain as it reaches the surface because leaves and branches intercept water. It modifies runoff. It changes how much water enters the soil and how much moves across it. Once forests begin forming, hydrology becomes more regulated, more biologically mediated, and less purely a matter of bare ground receiving weather. This is another reason forests are best thought of as planetary engineers. They are not passive recipients of climate and water. They actively shape both. The first tree-dominated landscapes would have been unlike anything Earth had seen before. Imagine walking through a Devonian grove where tall trunks rise from a ground layer still relatively simple by modern standards. There would be no flowering plants, no birds, no mammals, no rustling broadleaf canopy like that of a modern woodland. The sounds would be different, perhaps mostly wind, water, and the occasional movement of early arthropods. But the visual impact would be unmistakable. Shade would exist where before there had mostly been exposure. The ground would be broken by roots and litter. Light would filter rather than strike directly. The air close to the surface would feel different. The continents had entered a new phase. Once plants rose upward, competition changed too. Earlier low-growing plants mostly competed across the surface. Now they competed vertically. Access to light became even more important. Taller forms could overshadow smaller ones, which favoured greater investment in supportive tissues, branching patterns, and more elaborate transport systems. This led to new strategies, new trade-offs, and eventually more diverse plant communities. Some forms invested in height and long-term structure. Others remained lower but exploited gaps, wet areas, or disturbed ground. Ecological differentiation increased. Forest-like systems are not just collections of big plants. They are networks of competition, facilitation, and layered space. The rise of trees also altered the carbon cycle in ways that were both immediate and far-reaching. A tree stores much more carbon than a small plant simply because it has more body. Wood, bark-like tissues, roots, branches, and accumulated litter all represent carbon pulled from the atmosphere and fixed into biomass. When forests spread across landscapes, the amount of carbon held on land increased substantially. Some of that carbon returned to the atmosphere through decay and respiration, of course, but some became buried in soils, sediments, and longer-term reservoirs. Over geological time, this shift contributed to the larger drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide that was already underway due to plant-driven weathering and terrestrial expansion. Trees also intensified weathering because their root systems were larger, deeper, and more disruptive. A deeply rooted tree can physically penetrate the substrate, enhance water infiltration, and drive chemical reactions through root exudates and microbial associations. This means that tree-covered landscapes tend to weather rock more actively than landscapes covered only by shallow vegetation. More weathering means more nutrients released for biological use, but it also means more carbon dioxide can be removed from the atmosphere through silicate weathering pathways. The more successful trees became, the more they helped reshape the chemistry of Earth's surface system. This is where the story begins taking on its slightly ominous edge. The first trees were not only making land richer and more habitable, they were also participating in climate change, though not in the direction humans are currently pushing it. By drawing down carbon dioxide and changing the rate of weathering, expanding forests may have helped cool the planet significantly. During the late Devonian and into later periods, these changes were likely part of a broader set of feedbacks that influence global climate. Trees were helping create a more complex terrestrial world, but in doing so, they were also tugging on the thermostat of the entire planet. That double role is part of what makes them so fascinating. A forest is constructive and disruptive at the same time. It builds habitat, creates soil, stabilizes water flow, and supports biodiversity. It also changes atmospheric composition, affects nutrient delivery to oceans, and can push large-scale environmental systems into new states. Trees do not ask whether the planet is ready. They simply alter it as a consequence of living successfully. Early forests also transformed what happened after a plant died. Before large woody vegetation, dead organic matter on land was comparatively modest in size and structure. But once trees existed, falling trunks, branches, and thick litter became part of the system. This changed decomposition, nutrient cycling, and the physical nature of the ground. Wood is not the same as a small soft stem. It decomposes differently. It stores carbon differently. It creates habitat as it rots. It affects fire potential. Though fire regimes in those earliest forests would have depended on atmospheric oxygen and fuel structures that varied over time, in any case, the land surface became increasingly layered with organic remains, making forest floors into dynamic processing zones, rather than simple mineral surfaces with a few plant scraps scattered about. Roots became even more transformative under trees. A tree's root system does not merely anchor a trunk, it occupies volume, links soil horizons, supports fungal networks, and ties the atmosphere to the underground world continuously. Deep roots help bring water from below and can alter the chemistry and physical structure of the ground far beneath the surface. Once forests spread, the subsurface became much more biologically active. This deep engagement with the land influenced erosion patterns, river systems, sediment delivery, and nutrient fluxes to the sea. Rivers in particular began changing character. Vegetation stabilizes banks, traps sediment, and influences how channels migrate. The spread of trees and more substantial floodplain vegetation likely altered river morphology in important ways. Braided unstable systems can become more meandering and bank-confined when vegetation strengthens the margins. Sediments are stored differently. Floodplains become more structured. Organic matter enters channels in greater amounts. Aquatic habitats are affected by shade, debris and nutrient runoff. So even though trees were rising on land, their influence extended into freshwater systems and eventually into the oceans. There is also the matter of oxygen. As terrestrial plant biomass increased, more photosynthesis occurred on land, and over long spans this contributed to changes in atmospheric oxygen levels. The balance between oxygen production and the burial of organic carbon is complex, but large-scale plant expansion was part of the shift toward a world with richer atmospheric oxygen than earlier ages had seen. This had consequences not only for plants themselves, but for animals, combustion, and ecosystem metabolism more broadly. A tree may look like a quiet object, but geochemically it is quite the busy citizen. It is interesting too that the earliest forests were not yet familiar in their composition, but they were already familiar in their effects. Even if the species were strange by modern standards, the system-level behaviour begins to look recognisable. Canopies formed, soils deepened, litter accumulated, water cycles became more moderated, roots altered the ground, carbon was captured and stored. The world started acquiring features that define forested Earth today. In other words, even before modern forest lineages existed, the forest as a planetary process had begun. There must also have been something profound about shade itself entering the history of the continents in a new way. Before trees, much of the land surface was exposed to direct sunlight. With taller vegetation came cooler understories, reduced evaporation at ground level in some places, and microhabitats that differed sharply from open surroundings. Shade can seem like such a small comfort, especially if one is considering it while trying to find a bench in summer, but ecologically it changes who can live where, how quickly moisture is lost, and how organic matter breaks down. It helps create niches, and niches are invitations to evolution. By constructing vertical space, early trees also created opportunities for climbing, sheltering, feeding, and hiding that later terrestrial animals would exploit more fully. Arthropods were already on land, and as forests expanded, so did the variety of habitats available to them. Bark-like surfaces, litter layers, shaded soils, decaying wood, and higher plant structures all offered ecological possibilities. The first trees were not growing for the benefit of future animal diversity, of course, but they were making it possible all the same. That is one of the recurring themes of Earth history. One lineage changes the world in the ordinary course of pursuing its own success, and in doing so opens evolutionary opportunities for countless others. The appearance of trees also changed the visual identity of Earth from space, though no one was around to admire the view. Broad regions of the continents would gradually have taken on darker, more textured surfaces as tree cover spread. Weathering patterns changed. Dust production may have changed. Moisture recycling changed. The biosphere was becoming more strongly expressed on land, and forests were one of the clearest signs of that. If all of this sounds like a great deal of influence for organisms that cannot walk away from trouble, that is because stillness is sometimes misleading. Trees do not move quickly, but they are enormously effective at occupying space and altering conditions over time. A forest can cool an area, trap carbon, generate humidity, regulate runoff, build soil, and create habitat while giving the outward impression of standing there doing very little. It is a useful reminder that power in nature is not always loud. Sometimes it is rooted, patient, and extremely difficult to replace once removed. By the time the first true forests were taking shape, Earth had crossed another threshold. The land was no longer just colonized, it was becoming organized around large, long-lived plants that could dominate landscapes for extended periods. This changed the tempo of ecological processes. A tree lives longer than a small pioneer plant. It stores more biomass. It influences its surroundings for longer. It contributes to more persistent habitat structure. Forested systems therefore introduced a kind of ecological memory to the land. Their effects accumulated not just over seasons, but over years, centuries in later cases, and across generations of growth and decay. That persistence is part of why their rise mattered so much. Once forests begin shaping a region, the region develops under their influence. Soils evolve with them, rivers adjust to them, atmospheric exchange reflects them, nutrient cycles respond to them, remove them, and the system changes again. Keep them, and the system deepens into a forested mode of operation. This was already becoming true in the Devonian world, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Because as the first trees spread, the green transformation of Earth accelerated into something larger than local habitat building. Carbon was being locked away more effectively, weathering was increasing, atmospheric chemistry was shifting, the planet was being cooled, slowly but significantly, by forests doing exactly what made them successful. And that is where this story begins, moving from the rise of trees themselves into the much larger question of what happened when the continents, now rooted and darkened with the first forests, started stealing carbon from the sky on a planetary scale. Once trees began spreading across the land, the balance of the planet started to change in a deeper way. Until then, Earth's atmosphere, oceans, rocks, and living things had been interacting for billions of years, and life had already altered the air dramatically long before forests existed. But forests introduced a new scale of carbon capture on land, and they did it with remarkable efficiency. They took carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turned it into trunks, roots, bark, leaves, and litter, and then helped bury part of that carbon in soils and sediments. They also accelerated the weathering of rocks, which pulled still more carbon dioxide from the air through slow but powerful chemical pathways. Taken together, these processes amounted to a kind of planetary heist. The first forests did not ask permission, and they did not leave a note. They simply started removing enormous amounts of carbon from the sky. Carbon, of course, is one of the central actors in Earth history. It moves through the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, through living bodies as tissue, through oceans in dissolved forms, through rocks as carbonates, and through the deep earth in still longer cycles. The climate of the planet is tied closely to where that carbon sits at any given time. If a great deal of it is in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, the greenhouse effect is stronger, and the planet tends to be warmer. If large amounts are transferred into rock, ocean sediments, or long-lived biomass, the atmosphere loses some of that heat-trapping power. So when forests expanded on land, they were not merely adding greenery, they were changing the accounting system of the planet. At the simplest level, the process begins with photosynthesis. A plant takes in carbon dioxide, uses sunlight to power chemical reactions, and builds sugars and more complex organic molecules. Those molecules become stems, roots, leaves, spores, and eventually wood. The carbon that had been floating in the atmosphere becomes physically locked into living tissue. That much is familiar enough. Every garden shrub and roadside tree does it now without ceremony. But in the Devonian world, this process was increasingly happening across broad areas of land that had once been nearly bare. The scale was new, and scale is what turns a biological habit into a geochemical event. A large tree is essentially a standing carbon reservoir. It stores carbon in wood, in roots, in tissues that may persist for years or decades, and in the organic matter it sheds into the ground. A forest, then, is not just a collection of plants. It is an accumulating system for drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and distributing it into biomass and soil. Some of that carbon returns quickly when plants respire, die, or decay. But not all of it comes back at once, and not all of it comes back at all. Over long spans, some enters soils, some is buried in sediments, and some becomes locked away in ways that make it geologically meaningful. That is where the theft becomes more interesting. If plants simply took carbon dioxide out of the air, and then returned all of it almost immediately, the long-term impact would be limited. But forests do more than borrow carbon for a moment. They alter the conditions under which carbon moves through the system. Dead organic matter accumulates, roots penetrate the ground, soils deepen. Decomposition happens at varying rates depending on oxygen, moisture, temperature, and microbial communities. Some organic carbon gets buried before it can be fully oxidized back into the atmosphere. Over millions of years, even small imbalances between carbon taken in and carbon returned can matter enormously. Forests were not stealing carbon in the sense of making it vanish. They were relocating it, often into places from which it would not return quickly. There was also the matter of wood. The appearance of large woody plants changed carbon storage because wood is substantial, persistent, and not always easy to decompose. Lignin, one of the compounds that helps stiffen plant cell walls and support upright growth, is a formidable material. It gave plants strength and durability, but it also complicated the work of decay. The microbial world did eventually evolve ways to break lignin down effectively, but the rise of abundant woody tissues likely altered decomposition dynamics and carbon burial in important ways. More woody debris on land meant more carbon sitting in place, sometimes for long periods, sometimes entering wetlands and sediments where oxygen was limited and decay slowed further. Wet environments are especially important in this story. In waterlogged settings, dead plant material can accumulate faster than it decays because oxygen is scarce, and microbial breakdown is slowed. That means carbon that was once in the atmosphere and then in living plant tissues can become trapped in sediments. Across enough swamps, floodplains, deltas, and low oxygen depositional environments, this adds up. Later in Earth history, such processes would help create vast coal deposits, though the details vary by period and ecology. The larger point is that once forests and tree-sized plants spread, the land had new ways to capture, hold, and bury carbon on significant scales. If that were the whole story, it would already matter. But forests were doing something else as well, something slower, and in some ways even more consequential. They were increasing the chemical weathering of rocks. This process is less visually obvious than a tree growing, but it may have been one of the biggest ways terrestrial vegetation changed the planet. When rainwater mixes with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or in soil air, it forms weak carbonic acid. That acidic water reacts with silicate minerals in rocks, breaking them down through weathering. The products are transported by rivers to the oceans, where eventually carbon can become part of carbonate sediments and rocks. In broad terms, this process moves carbon from the atmosphere into the lithosphere over long timescales. Plants accelerate that cycle in several ways. Their roots penetrate rock and sediment, increasing the surface area available for reaction. Root systems and associated fungi release acids and other compounds that enhance mineral breakdown. Vegetated soils retain water and maintain conditions that support ongoing chemical weathering. Carbon dioxide concentrations in soils can be quite high because roots and microbes respire there, and that enriches the water moving through the ground with carbonic acid. So a forested landscape does not just sit on rock, it actively digests it, chemically speaking, and in doing so helps pull atmospheric carbon along for the ride. This is one of the reasons the rise of forests was so consequential. Trees did not only capture carbon directly in their tissues, they also increased the planet's ability to move carbon into long-term geological storage. A landscape covered in deep-rooted vegetation weathers differently from a landscape with only thin ground cover or bare mineral surfaces. Over millions of years, the difference is huge. Forests effectively opened more pathways by which atmospheric carbon dioxide could be removed from the sky and locked into ocean chemistry and rock. There is a certain dry humour in how indirect this is. A tree wants nutrients. To get them, it grows roots, partners with fungi, and speeds up weathering. The planet, meanwhile, finds its atmospheric chemistry being altered as a side effect. No tree ever held a meeting about global climate strategy. It simply pursued survival and growth with considerable thoroughness, and the atmosphere had to adjust accordingly. nature is full of such unintended consequences, though usually on a smaller scale. In this case, the scale happened to be planetary. As forests spread, the carbon cycle became more land-driven than before. The continents, once comparatively quiet in biogeochemical terms, became active participants in regulating atmospheric composition. Carbon that had once lingered in the air or cycled primarily through oceans was now being intercepted by terrestrial ecosystems on a growing scale. River systems carried more dissolved products of weathering to the sea. Soil stored more organic carbon. Plant biomass covered larger areas. The continents were no longer just places where geology happened under the open sky. They had become machines for processing carbon. This shift likely happened gradually but decisively during the Devonian and afterward. As plant communities became more extensive, deeper-rooted and structurally more complex, their influence accumulated. It is difficult to assign exact numbers with complete confidence for such ancient worlds, because the evidence must be pieced together from rocks, isotopes, fossils, sediments, and models, each with its own uncertainties. But the broad picture is clear. The rise of large terrestrial plants was associated with major changes in carbon dioxide levels, weathering intensity, and Earth's climate system. Enough carbon was being drawn down from the atmosphere that the planet began trending toward cooler conditions. Now, carbon dioxide on early Earth was often much higher than in more recent times, and the world before forests had functioned under those conditions for ages. Warm climates, different ocean chemistries and atmospheric structures had all existed within that framework. So when forests began removing carbon on a large scale, they were not simply tweaking the thermostat by a degree or two in some tidy modern sense. They were helping shift the Earth system out of one long-standing mode and toward another. That kind of transition rarely happens without consequences. Some of those consequences extended into the oceans. Increased weathering on land changes the delivery of nutrients such as phosphorus to rivers and seas. More nutrients can stimulate marine productivity. More productivity can affect oxygen levels in the water, especially if large amounts of organic matter sink and decompose consuming oxygen. The links are complex and often regionally variable, but the point is that what forests did on land did not stay neatly on land. The chemistry of runoff changed, sediments changed, nutrient fluxes changed. The oceans, like the atmosphere, had to respond to the new terrestrial regime. The carbon drawdown also may have contributed to ecological disruptions of various kinds. A world in the midst of major atmospheric and climatic change is a world where many systems become unstable. Some marine environments may have experienced increased nutrient loading and oxygen stress. Weather patterns would have shifted over time. Seasonality and temperature gradients could change. The spread of trees, so often framed as a triumph of terrestrial life, may therefore have had a destabilizing side as well. They built the modern style of habitable land, yes, but they also helped create new pressures elsewhere in the Earth system. Forests were beneficial and disruptive at once, and that dual role remains familiar even now. It also helps to remember that this great carbon theft was not a single event but an extended campaign. Different plant lineages spread at different times. Rooting depth increased gradually. Forests expanded unevenly across different regions and climates. Carbon burial varied with geography, hydrology, and the structure of ecosystems. The heist was slow, methodical, and unusually dependent on fungal cooperation. If one insists on imagining forests as criminals, they were very patient ones. The kind who spend tens of millions of years quietly moving assets into difficult-to-trace accounts under the seabed. Even the atmosphere above a forest behaves differently from the atmosphere above bare ground. Transpiration adds water vapour. Canopies alter temperature and air movement near the surface. Soil respiration enriches the air near the ground with carbon dioxide, which can then feed chemical weathering processes. The whole land-atmosphere interface changes once forests become widespread. That matters because carbon cycling is not just a matter of molecules appearing and disappearing. It is a matter of exchange rates, residence times, feedbacks, and pathways. Forests changed all of those. Another reason trees were especially potent is longevity. A small annual plant captures carbon and returns much of it rather quickly. A tree, by contrast, may store carbon for years, decades, or longer, depending on the lineage and conditions. Its wood and roots represent long-lived pools. When it dies, decomposition may be slow, and some material may enter the soil or sediment system. So forests introduce carbon storage not just in greater quantity, but with greater persistence. In climate terms, persistence matters. A molecule kept out of the atmosphere for long enough can influence the system in a meaningful way. Below ground, forests added still more complexity. Root turnover contributes organic matter to soils continuously. Fine roots die and regrow. Exudates feed microbes. Fungal networks expand and decay. Soil aggregates form, protecting some organic carbon from rapid decomposition. Waterlogging in some settings can preserve organic matter for long periods. All of this means that a forest stores carbon in places you cannot see, as well as in the visible trunks and branches above. In many ecosystems today, a large share of carbon is below ground, and the same broad principle would have mattered in ancient forested landscapes. The theft was not merely above board, quite a lot of it was buried. It is also possible that the timing of biological innovation mattered enormously. Once deep-rooted trees such as Archaeopteris and other Devonian plants spread widely, the capacity of terrestrial ecosystems to influence weathering and carbon burial likely increased sharply. Shallow plant cover can do only so much. Deep roots and long-lived woody structures amplify the impact. So the rise of true forests was not just more of the same, it was an escalation. The continents went from being lightly occupied by green life to being heavily engaged in atmospheric chemistry. This new terrestrial power may help explain why the later Devonian world shows signs of significant environmental change. Geochemical proxies and sedimentary records suggest shifts consistent with declining carbon dioxide and cooling, though the details remain actively studied and debated. Still, the broad connection between expanding land plants and atmospheric drawdown is one of the major themes of Paleozoic Earth history. Trees were not innocent bystanders while the climate changed. They were among the main agents driving it. That does not make them villains, of course. One should be careful with moral language when discussing Devonian flora, as the legal system is not well equipped for prosecuting ancient progymnosperms. Trees did what life always does. They found a way to prosper. But prosperity at scale alters environments, and once plants rose high, rooted deeply, and spread broadly, their success became inseparable from planetary transformation. There is something particularly striking about the asymmetry here. Before forests, carbon dioxide had accumulated in the atmosphere through volcanic outgassing, long-term cycling, and the absence of equally strong removal processes on land. Then plants arrived and began quietly redirecting the flow. They did not need to dominate every continent instantly. They only needed enough reach and enough time. Given millions of years, even a modest annual removal rate can change a world. Forests are masters of this kind of slow power. They do not rush, but they rarely stop working. And once atmospheric carbon dioxide begins to fall, other feedbacks can reinforce the trend. Cooler conditions may alter weathering, ice growth, ocean circulation, and habitat distributions. Vegetation itself can shift in response. Ecosystems reconfigure. The Earth system is full of thresholds and interactions, and pulling one major lever, in this case carbon drawdown by forests and enhanced weathering, can set many others in motion. The planet was not only getting greener, it was becoming less like the warm, high-carbon world that had preceded the rise of land plants. In a way, this chapter of Earth history is a useful corrective to a modern habit of underestimating plants. Animals are easier for us to notice. They move, they make noise, and they're generally more willing to behave as though the world is about them. Trees are quieter. But when it comes to changing the chemistry of the atmosphere, reorganizing the carbon cycle, and influencing climate over geologic time, trees have done things most animal lineages can scarcely imagine. A forest can remove carbon molecule by molecule with no sign of hurry, and still end up transforming the planet more thoroughly than any stampede ever could. It also means that when we talk about forests today, we are talking about a lineage of systems with an ancient record of planetary influence. Forests help create soils, regulate hydrology, and build terrestrial habitat, but they also change carbon dioxide levels enough to contribute to large-scale cooling. That is what makes the present destruction of forests so troubling. We're not merely removing scenery, we are dismantling parts of the machinery that long ago helped make Earth habitable in its modern form. But that modern echo can wait a little longer, because back in the Devonian and beyond, the immediate result of this great carbon theft was becoming harder and harder for the planet to ignore. The air was changing, the chemistry of land and sea was shifting, and the world was beginning to cool under the growing influence of its own new forests. As the forests spread, Earth began to lose a habit it had kept for a very long time. It had been, for much of its earlier history, a warmer world under a heavier greenhouse sky, a planet with abundant carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and far fewer large land-based systems capable of pulling that carbon down and locking it away. The rise of trees changed that balance, not quickly by human standards, not in a few seasons or even a few thousand years, but steadily enough that the climate itself began to respond. The forests were not simply growing on the planet anymore, they were changing the temperature of it. That is a remarkable thing to pause over. We are used to thinking of climate as something large and impersonal, the work of oceans, volcanoes, orbital cycles, and atmospheric chemistry, which of course it is. But forests became part of that machinery. They did not merely endure climate, they began helping to set it. They pulled carbon dioxide from the air, accelerated the weathering of rocks, buried organic carbon in soils and sediments, and altered how water moved between land and sky. By doing so, they helped weaken the greenhouse blanket that had kept Earth comparatively warm, over immense stretches of time that meant cooling. At first glance, this can feel a little counterintuitive. A forest, after all, can feel warm and sheltered when you stand inside one. It blocks wind, it traps humidity. On a still summer day, it can feel downright committed to keeping every last bit of air in place. But planetary climate is not a matter of how shaded a path feels beneath a canopy. It is a matter of energy balance and atmospheric composition. Carbon dioxide is one of the key gases that traps heat radiating away from Earth's surface. Lower the concentration of that gas over long time scales, and the planet loses some of its ability to hold on to warmth. It begins gradually to cool. The trees did not do this alone, but they played a central role. A forest captures carbon directly in biomass, yes, but that is only part of its climatic influence. The deeper and more important change came from the way forests intensified chemical weathering on land. Rooted vegetation, especially deep-rooted trees, helped break down silicate rocks, and that process ultimately removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through long geological pathways. The chemistry is slow and not especially showy, which perhaps explains why it gets less popular attention than volcanoes or ice ages. But in Earth history, slow chemistry is often what decides everything. Rainwater mixed with carbon dioxide forms weak carbonic acid. That acidic water reacts with silicate minerals in rocks. The products of weathering are carried by rivers to the oceans, where some carbon ends up stored in carbonate sediments and rocks over very long timescales. Plants speed up this weathering by driving roots into rock, releasing acids and organic compounds, retaining moisture in soils, and fostering microbial and fungal communities that intensify mineral breakdown. The result is that a forested continent weathers more actively than a barren one, and that means more atmospheric carbon can be drawn into long-term storage. The larger and deeper the forest became, the stronger this effect likely was. This is why the rise of trees matters so much more than the earlier spread of thin plant cover alone. Low vegetation can influence the surface. Trees can transform entire landscapes and alter geochemical cycles at scale. Their roots reach farther, their biomass is greater, their litter is more substantial, and their effect on soil formation is more intense. Once forests spread across broad regions, the continents were no longer chemically quiet. They had become active participants in regulating the atmosphere. There is a certain irony in the fact that forests, which we often associate with life and fertility, and all the pleasant green things one imagines while trying to avoid answering emails, were also helping push the planet toward colder conditions. But that is exactly what made them such powerful engineers. They were not merely decorating the land. They were changing the way the Earth system functioned. Their success came with consequences, and one of the largest was a gradual rebalancing of climate. The Devonian world, before this transition had fully played out, was in many ways still a greenhouse world. Carbon dioxide levels were much higher than those that shaped recent human civilization. The land was greener than it had once been, but the atmospheric system still carried the legacy of deep time. As forests thickened and roots penetrated more deeply into the continents, that began to change. Carbon dioxide was drawn down more effectively. Weathering intensified. More nutrients moved through rivers. More carbon was buried in organic, rich sediments and soils. Over millions of years, all of this added up. We should be careful here, because Earth's climate is never controlled by one process alone. Tectonics matters, volcanic outgassing matters, ocean circulation matters, the position of continents matters, orbital variations matter, ice itself matters once it appears in significant amounts, but the spread of forests was one of the major new ingredients in the system, and its timing aligns closely with evidence for major climatic shifts. Many researchers see the expansion of land plants, especially deep-rooted forests, as an important driver of declining atmospheric carbon dioxide and eventual cooling in the late Devonian and beyond. In other words, once the forests matured, the air was not the same air anymore. Cooling on a planetary scale is not just a number changing in a ledger. It alters precipitation patterns, seasonality, weathering feedbacks, ocean structure, and habitat ranges. A slightly cooler world over long spans can become a very different world. Ice may begin to accumulate more readily at high latitudes or on elevated land masses. Temperature gradients shift. The hydrological cycle changes. Certain ecosystems expand while others contract. Sea levels can respond as more water is stored in ice. The atmosphere's chemistry, circulation, and moisture dynamics all begin behaving differently. One of the most striking possibilities is that the rise of forests helped contribute to glacial conditions. There is evidence for glaciation in the late Devonian, particularly in parts of what was then Gondwana, and the broader cooling trend of the later Paleozoic set the stage for more extensive icehouse conditions in the Carboniferous and Permian. It would be too simple to say that trees alone made the ice come, but it is not too simple to say that trees helped move the climate in that direction. They were part of the reason the greenhouse weakened. They were part of the reason the thermostat turned down. That is an extraordinary reversal from how many people instinctively imagine the ancient Earth. One might suppose that as life became more abundant and land became more habitable, the world simply became more stable and pleasant, like a barren lot turned into a nicely managed garden. But Earth history is not that obliging. The spread of forests made the continents richer, yes. It built soils, created habitats, and laid the foundation for terrestrial ecosystems. But it also introduced new instabilities by changing the atmosphere so dramatically. The world became more alive and, in some respects, more climatically volatile because of it. Forests also influence climate through water. A tree is not just a carbon-catching column. It is a water-moving device. It takes water from the soil and sends a great deal of it back into the atmosphere through transpiration. Entire forests recycle moisture, helping shape local and regional rainfall patterns. Once forests became widespread, they likely altered the hydrological cycle in ways that fed back into climate. More vegetation can mean more humidity in some regions, more cloud formation, and different precipitation dynamics. forest cover also changes the roughness of the land surface, which affects wind and air movement near the ground. None of these processes acts in isolation, but together they help make forests climatic actors rather than passive scenery. There is a nice, slightly absurd image here if you imagine the first forests as a sort of slow planetary bureaucracy. While animals had not yet fully taken to land in all the later flamboyant ways, the trees were already up there handling air chemistry, moisture transport and rock decomposition with quiet administrative efficiency. No fuss, no dramatic speeches, just millions of years of persistent paperwork with the atmosphere until the climate eventually noticed it had been reorganized. Another part of this story involves albedo, the reflectivity of Earth's surface. In simple terms, lighter surfaces reflect more sunlight, while darker surfaces absorb more. Forests tend to be darker than bare rock or some open landscapes, which means they can reduce reflectivity and in some cases warm the surface locally. That might sound as if forests should heat the planet rather than cool it. And in some modern contexts, especially at certain latitudes, surface darkening by forests can indeed complicate their climatic effect. But on the ancient high-carbon Earth, the dominant long-term influence of the first forests appears to have been through carbon dioxide drawdown and weathering, not just surface reflectivity. Over geological time, removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere is a far more powerful cooling mechanism than modest changes in albedo from vegetation cover alone. This is one reason the ancient story matters so much for thinking clearly. Climate is never about one neat effect. It is about competing influences operating on different scales and timescales. A forest can absorb more sunlight at the surface, release more water vapor locally, cool a region through shade and evapotranspiration, and yet cool the entire planet over millions of years by drawing down carbon dioxide. All of these things can be true at once. The Earth system is not fond of tidy one-line summaries, though people do keep trying. As cooling progressed, the oceans felt it too. Cooler climates affect ocean circulation, sea surface temperatures, and the distribution of oxygen and nutrients. Increased weathering on land also delivered more material to rivers and coastlines, which could stimulate marine productivity in some regions. More productivity can mean more organic matter sinking and decomposing, which can lead to oxygen-poor conditions in the water. So while forests were cooling the planet, they were also potentially contributing to marine stress through nutrient runoff and changing ocean chemistry. Once again, the same biological revolution that made land more productive may have helped destabilize parts of the sea. This double effect is one of the reasons the late Devonian is such an interesting period. It was a time of major ecological and environmental change, with marine extinctions and episodes of widespread oxygen-poor conditions in the oceans. The exact causes and sequence remain complex, and multiple factors were certainly involved, but the expansion of land plants appears to have been part of the puzzle. It is a strange thought that the greening of the continents, something that sounds almost entirely wholesome, may have had consequences that rippled outward into marine crises, but that is the planet for you. Improvements in one domain are not always received as improvements everywhere else, and yet the cooling mattered not only as a stressor, but as a long-term foundation for the Earth we know. A world with lower carbon dioxide, more complex terrestrial ecosystems, developing soils and increasingly structured climates is a world much closer to the one in which later forests, animals and eventually people could thrive. The forests that cooled the planet were not simply creating hardship. They were building a new mode of Earth system operation, one in which land vegetation was deeply entwined with climate stability and atmospheric regulation. That may be one of the most useful lessons from this entire story. Forests are not external to planetary function. They are part of it. They helped establish the relationships between atmosphere, land, water, and life that define the habitable Earth. Once they became widespread, the climate could no longer be understood apart from them. Remove enough forest, and the system shifts. Add enough forest, and the system shifts. Forests do not merely live under a climate, they help write it. There must also have been a deeply physical change in the feel of the world as cooling advanced. The continents, once harsh and largely exposed, now carried regions of shade, moisture retention, and moderated ground temperatures under growing vegetation. At the same time, the atmosphere above the whole planet was gradually giving up some of its greenhouse strength. Weather patterns changed. Seasonal contrasts may have shifted in some areas. High latitude or high elevation regions that had once remained warmer began crossing thresholds toward ice. Earth was being pulled into a cooler, more dynamically varied state by organisms rooted in place. It is almost difficult not to admire the scale of the thing. A lineage of plants, beginning as low green pioneers on wet stone, had by this point altered enough of the carbon cycle to influence glaciation. There are not many stories in natural history where one can say, quite calmly, that trees helped cool the planet into icehouse conditions and still be speaking literally. It is not the kind of achievement one usually includes in a gardening catalogue, but it certainly deserves mention. The cooling also changed what kinds of ecosystems could exist later. Climate sets broad limits on habitability, on rainfall patterns, on fire regimes, on productivity, and on the geographic spread of lineages. By shifting the thermal background of the Earth, forests helped define the stage on which later terrestrial evolution would play out. Amphibians, reptiles, seed plants, vast swamp forests, and ultimately many later ecosystems emerged in a world already transformed by earlier plant-driven cooling. The forest revolution did not end with the first trees standing tall. It continued through its climatic consequences. Still, cooling is never the whole story by itself. As the atmosphere changed, the physical and chemical links between land and sea grew stronger. More weathering meant more dissolved ions in rivers. More roots meant different erosion patterns. More organic matter on land meant more material entering floodplains, deltas, and coasts. Forests were not only changing temperature, they were changing the plumbing and chemistry of the planet. Rivers carried a different kind of world to the oceans than they had before. Coastlines received different sediments. Marine systems received new pulses of nutrients and carbon. The air, the land, and the water were now joined by forests in a much tighter conversation than ever before. And that conversation was only getting louder, because once trees had cooled the planet enough to matter on a global scale, they continued doing what successful forests always do. They spread, deepened, thickened, and transformed everything they touched, from the shape of rivers to the chemistry of the seas to the very breath of the atmosphere itself. By the time trees had spread widely enough to cool the planet, they were doing far more than lowering carbon dioxide and standing about looking historically important. They were changing the way the Earth moved water, sediment, nutrients, and gases. In earlier ages, before deep roots and forest cover became common, rivers behaved differently, coastlines received different deliveries from the land, and the atmosphere above the continents was shaped by a much simpler surface. Once forests arrived in force, that simplicity ended. Trees did not merely occupy the land, they reorganized the exchanges between land, sea, and sky. It helps to begin with rivers, because rivers are where so many of these changes become visible. A river is not just water moving downhill, it is the expression of climate, topography, sediment supply, and the rough texture of the land it crosses. Change the land and the river changes too. Before widespread vegetation, much of the continental surface would have been more exposed, less anchored, and more vulnerable to rapid runoff and erosion. Sediment could move more freely. Banks were weaker. Channels may often have been broader, shallower, more braided, and less stable in many settings. Water falling on bare or sparsely covered ground behaves differently than water falling on a rooted landscape. Once trees and extensive vegetation took hold, river systems began to acquire a new kind of order. Roots strengthened banks, vegetation trapped sediment, organic matter accumulated along channels and floodplains. Water infiltrated soils more effectively rather than racing immediately across the surface. This all sounds terribly tidy when said in a sentence, but in geological terms it was revolutionary. A rooted floodplain behaves differently from an unrooted one. It resists erosion in some places, stores finer sediments in others, and encourages channels to become narrower, deeper, and more sinuous. In short, trees helped rivers become more like the rivers we know. That shift from unstable, sediment-rich systems toward more vegetated and organised channels had large consequences. Meandering rivers, with their sweeping curves and more defined banks, are strongly influenced by vegetation. Plant roots hold the edges together long enough for bends to form and migrate in characteristic ways. Floodplains can build up with fine overbank sediments trapped by vegetation. Levees can develop. Wetlands and backwaters become more persistent. Even the very geometry of river landscapes begins to change. If one could compare a pre-forest river valley to a forested Devonian or later one, the contrast would not simply be greener banks. It would be a different style of landscape altogether. There is something slightly amusing in the thought that trees, which are often praised for being calm and still, turned out to be very influential river managers. They did not build dams in the beaver sense, though later forests would certainly provide plenty of raw material for that sort of ambition. But by occupying the banks and anchoring the ground, they effectively supervised the flow of water and sediment on a continental scale. One could say they made rivers more civilized, though rivers themselves may not have appreciated the paperwork involved. This new river behaviour also affected erosion. Bare landscapes can shed large volumes of sediment quickly during storms or seasonal runoff. Vegetated landscapes, especially those with trees and developing soils, spread that process out. Water soaks in more readily, roots hold material in place, and not every rainfall becomes an immediate sediment parade toward the sea. That does not mean erosion stops. Forested landscapes can erode vigorously under the right conditions, particularly on steep slopes or in disturbed areas, but the style of erosion changes. It becomes filtered through roots, soils, and biological structure. And once rivers carry different kinds of sediment, at different rates, and from differently weathered landscapes, the sea receives a different package. This is where the story moves from river valleys to coastlines and ocean basins. Trees altered what the continents exported. More chemical weathering meant more dissolved ions moving seaward. More soils meant different particle sizes and more organic material entering channels. More vegetation meant more nutrients being mobilized and stored, then flushed under various conditions. Coastal waters and inland seas were no longer fed by the same sort of continents they had known before forests spread. Nutrients are especially important here. As roots and fungal networks accelerated the weathering of rocks, they helped release phosphorus and other elements that eventually made their way through rivers, into lakes, estuaries, and marine environments. Nutrients are useful, of course. Life depends on them. But as with many good things, the dose matters. A sudden or sustained increase in nutrient delivery can stimulate enormous blooms of algae and plankton in aquatic environments. When that organic matter dies and sinks, its decomposition consumes oxygen. If enough of this happens, the water can become oxygen poor or even anoxic, a condition unpleasant for many marine organisms and especially bad for creatures with little interest in suffocation. This is one of the reasons the rise of forests may have been linked to marine stress during parts of the late Devonian. The greening of the continents did not only draw down carbon dioxide and cool the climate, it also increased nutrient runoff and organic matter fluxes to the sea. In certain settings, that may have encouraged widespread oxygen depletion in marine waters. The result would have been a sea increasingly troubled by low oxygen events, changing productivity patterns, and disruptions to established ecosystems. It is a sobering little lesson in Earth system complexity. Trees helped make land richer and more habitable, while possibly making parts of the sea more unstable and for some creatures distinctly less inviting. If that sounds familiar in a modern way, it should. Today, excessive nutrient runoff from land can produce dead zones in lakes, estuaries, and coastal seas, where oxygen drops so low that many organisms cannot survive. The causes now are heavily tied to agriculture, fertilizers, and human land use, but the underlying principle is ancient. Change the way the land processes nutrients and water, and aquatic systems respond. The Devonian world may have experienced its own version of this, not through tractors and drainage ditches, but through the first truly effective biological conquest of the continents. Trees also influenced sediment delivery in ways that mattered to marine habitats. As rivers became more structured and floodplains more effective at storing fine material, sediment pulses may have shifted in timing and composition. Delta systems, coastal plains, and shallow marine basins would have responded to those changes. Fine-grained muds, organic-rich deposits, and altered channel networks can all leave signatures in the rock record. Paleogeographers and sedimentologists, who are the sort of people capable of looking at ancient mudstone with genuine excitement, have long been interested in the appearance of more stabilised floodplain environments and vegetation-linked river styles. It is one of the ways trees announce their arrival to the deep past, by changing how the sediment behaves. There is also the simple fact that trees changed how much of the continents remained moist enough to sustain prolonged soil and plant activity. Forests shade the ground, reduce evaporation at the surface, and cycle large amounts of water through transpiration. This means the presence of trees can increase humidity locally and regionally, sometimes helping create rainfall patterns that support more vegetation in return. A forest is not just a community of plants making use of existing moisture, it is a moisture processing system. In some regions, once forests become established, they help maintain the very hydrological conditions they require. That matters for rivers because precipitation patterns influence river discharge, seasonality, flooding, and erosion. A more forested world may have seen different moisture recycling over land, different storm responses, and different persistence of wetlands and floodplain habitats. It is difficult to reconstruct every detail for such ancient worlds, but the principle is solid. Once trees became common, the water cycle above the continents became more tightly linked to biology. Rain no longer fell only on rock and sparse ground cover. It fell on canopies, litter layers, root zones, and soils able to hold and move it in new ways. And then there is the air itself. Trees had already altered atmospheric carbon dioxide and contributed to cooling, but their effect on the atmosphere went beyond greenhouse gases alone. Expanding terrestrial biomass, along with the burial of organic carbon, helped shift the balance of oxygen over long spans as well. Photosynthesis releases oxygen, but oxygen only accumulates in the atmosphere over geologic time if some of the carbon fixed by photosynthesis is buried and prevented from returning immediately through decay and respiration. Forests, with their abundant biomass and their role in soil formation and carbon burial, contributed to that process. Atmospheric oxygen levels in the Paleozoic were influenced by many interacting factors, and the exact curves remain matters of active study. But there is little doubt that the rise of extensive land vegetation was part of the reason oxygen became more abundant than in earlier ages. That has implications not only for combustion and atmospheric chemistry, but for animal life. Higher oxygen can support larger body sizes in some groups and more energetically active lifestyles in others. It changes what is physiologically possible. So when trees reshaped the air, they were not merely changing what the atmosphere contained, they were changing what future organisms could do with a breath. This is where the story starts to feel grand in a very literal sense. Trees were modifying rivers at the surface, nutrients at the coast, oxygen in the sky, carbon in the climate system, and water cycling across the land. That is a great deal of responsibility for organisms that cannot relocate when conditions become inconvenient. And yet trees have always exercised that kind of influence through persistence. A forest does not need to move quickly if it can hold a landscape long enough to rearrange its chemistry. One effect of forests on the air that is easy to overlook is the daily and seasonal moderation of conditions near the ground. Under a forest canopy, temperature swings are often smaller, Humidity is often higher, wind speeds are reduced, the ground remains cooler in some conditions and more insulated in others. This creates habitats not only for plants and microbes but for animals, especially small land dwellers that would otherwise face a harsher environment. The first trees therefore changed not just the composition of the global atmosphere, but the practical atmosphere of life at ground level. They made land more livable minute by minute, shade by shade, by altering the physical feel of the environment. At the same time, the forests were also making the land darker and rougher from above. A bare or lightly vegetated surface reflects and exchanges energy differently from a canopy-covered one. Forests modify turbulence, albedo, and heat exchange. Again, no single one of these effects explains everything, but together they mean the atmosphere interacts with a forested world differently than with a barren one. The lower atmosphere, especially over land, became more strongly shaped by living surfaces rather than by raw mineral ones. This is a profound transition in planetary character. Earth was no longer merely a rocky planet with weather. It was becoming a biological planet whose weather increasingly reflected the structure of its biosphere. The seas, meanwhile, were still adjusting to what the continents were sending them. Increased nutrient supply can enhance marine productivity, but too much can destabilize food webs and oxygen balance. In some Devonian settings, widespread black shales indicate low oxygen conditions in marine basins. These deposits suggest episodes when large areas of the seafloor were starved of oxygen, a serious problem for many forms of marine life. Multiple causes were likely involved, including climate shifts, sea level change, and circulation patterns. But terrestrial plant expansion fits into the picture in an important way by increasing nutrient delivery and altering the chemistry of runoff. There is something almost unfairly efficient about the whole sequence. Trees deepen roots to support themselves and gather nutrients. That increases weathering. Weathering and vegetation change the runoff. Runoff enriches the sea. Marine productivity booms in some areas, oxygen collapses in others, and suddenly the oceans are dealing with the consequences of a botanical innovation on land. It is the planetary equivalent of renovating one room and discovering 3 others have flooded. Forests also introduce more organic debris into river and coastal systems. Branches, trunks, roots, and leaf-like tissues entering waterways would have changed aquatic habitats. Woody debris in rivers affects flow, sediment trapping, and habitat complexity. Even in ancient systems, increasing plant structure along and within channels likely altered freshwater ecology. Floodplains would have accumulated more litter. Wetlands would have become more organic rich. Coastal deltas may have received larger inputs of terrestrial organic matter. In each case, the land-sea boundary became more biologically complex. Another subtle but important change involved the atmosphere's water vapour pathways. Forests transpire tremendous quantities of water. Modern large forests contribute meaningfully to continental rainfall patterns by recycling moisture inland. While the precise dynamics of Devonian and later Paleozoic forests would have differed from today's biomes, the principle remains. As tree cover spread, it likely enhanced atmospheric moisture recycling over some regions, helping to create more interconnected land-atmosphere water systems. This could reinforce forest persistence in wetter zones and help extend the climatic influence of vegetation beyond the places where roots actually touch the soil. There is also the long view to consider. Once trees rewrote rivers, seas, and air, they also rewrote the template for all future terrestrial ecosystems. Later forests, swamp systems, seed plant radiations, amphibian habitats, insect diversification, and eventually the landscapes in which vertebrates truly flourished all unfolded in a world already modified by these earlier changes. Rivers had become more structured. Soils had become deeper. Coastal nutrient cycles had changed. The atmosphere had become more oxygen-rich and less burdened by carbon dioxide than before. These were not minor background details. They were the stage itself, and if one follows that stage forward far enough, the modern world begins to look less like a fresh creation and more like an inheritance. Human agriculture depends on soils whose existence traces back to plant-rooted landscapes. Our climate is regulated in part by carbon cycles profoundly shaped by ancient forests. The rivers we dam, redirect, and complain about during flood season are descendants of river systems long ago transformed by vegetation. The oxygen we breathe belongs to an atmospheric regime strongly shaped by land plants. Even the simple fact that a hillside tends to stay a hillside rather than immediately becoming a travelling sediment exhibit owes something to roots and the ecological traditions they established. That is why the destruction of forests today is so dangerous. It is not merely the loss of trees as objects, it is the dismantling of systems that regulate water, trap sediment, stabilise coasts, maintain rainfall patterns, store carbon, and support atmospheric balance. Ancient forests helped build these relationships into the Earth system. Modern deforestation tears at them in the opposite direction. Remove forests at scale and rivers can become flashier, muddier, and less stable. Nutrients run off more aggressively. Coastal waters become stressed. Regional climates dry or warm. Carbon returns to the air. The old engineering starts to fail. Back in the Devonian and the ages that followed, however, those systems were still being established. Trees were tightening the connections between land and sea, between rainfall and roots, between atmosphere and soil. The world was becoming more organised around living structure. The continents no longer met the ocean as largely bare mineral masses. They met it through forests, floodplains, deltas, and rooted landscapes, and the air above them no longer floated over a mostly exposed surface. It moved across canopies, through transpiring leaves, and over the growing machinery of a planet increasingly shaped by wood, roots, and time. By then, Earth was no longer just a place where plants had succeeded. It was becoming a place where other large forms of life could follow them onto land in earnest, because trees had not only changed the chemistry and hydrology of the planet, they had created habitats, climates, and living surfaces that made the continents ready for animals to become more than temporary visitors. Once trees had changed the rivers, darkened the land, thickened the soils, and altered the air itself, the continents were no longer simply places where plants could survive. They had become places where animals could live. That may sound obvious in hindsight, because we live in a world where the land is full of creatures doing highly committed things with legs, wings, jaws, and very mixed levels of judgment. But for most of Earth's history, that was not the case. Life had flourished in the oceans for an immense span of time before animals truly took hold on land. The continents had existed long before they were busy. So when forests, soils, and stable terrestrial habitats finally came together, they did more than change the look of the planet. They opened the door to one of the biggest ecological expansions in Earth history. The land stopped being mainly a surface and became an inhabited world. That change did not happen in a single moment, despite the title suggesting the sort of dramatic afternoon when everything suddenly acquires pause and starts making questionable noises in the undergrowth. It was gradual, uneven, and made possible by all the work plants had already done. Animals did not conquer bare rock. They followed a world that had been made softer, wetter in places, more oxygen-rich, and far more chemically and structurally complex than it had once been. The first animals onto land were not arriving as heroic pioneers into a ready-made paradise. They were moving into habitats that trees, roots, fungi, microbes, and soils had spent millions of years constructing. That sequence matters. Animals are often more noticeable than plants because they move, eat one another in memorable ways, and tend to treat every environment as either a home, a meal, or a misunderstanding. But in deep history, plants were the advance team. They made the land worth invading. Before vegetation spread, terrestrial life faced a serious list of problems. There was little food above ground, little shelter from drying out, harsher temperature swings, fewer stable moist habitats, and no rich soils full of small organisms and decaying matter to form the basis of food webs. Once plant cover expanded and forests began structuring the land, all of that changed. Suddenly there was organic material to eat, surfaces to hide in, humid spaces under litter and bark, root zones full of microbes, and oxygen-rich air above. The continents had acquired resources. The earliest animals to exploit these opportunities were almost certainly small. Arthropods, with their segmented bodies, exoskeletons, and general evolutionary willingness to try almost anything once, were especially well suited to terrestrial experiments. They had already done very well in the oceans, and some lineages began venturing onto land relatively early. Among the first would have been forms related to modern millipedes, centipedes, mites, and other small arthropod groups, though the exact identities and sequence remain a matter of fossils, interpretation, and the occasional paleontological argument delivered with great seriousness over very tiny legs. These early land animals did not need forests in the later lush sense right away, but they did need something the older barren continents had not provided. They needed food and moisture. A thin green world of early plants, microbial films and damp ground offered the first opportunities. Then, as soils deepened and plant litter accumulated, the options multiplied. Dead plant matter is not glamorous, but ecologically it is gold. It feeds fungi and microbes. Those microbes and fungi feed small grazers and scavengers. Detritus-based food webs emerge. Once the ground is layered with decaying organic matter, the land begins supporting animals not only through living plants but through everything that has died and is being recycled. That is how many ecosystems really get going, not from some perfect tidy chain of fresh leaves to noble herbivore, but from rot, crumbs, spores and very small things quietly making a living in the dark. The forest floor, even in its early forms, was therefore one of the most important inventions in the history of animals. Before that, the land surface had been mostly mineral, with only modest organic accumulation. With trees and more substantial vegetation, the ground became padded with litter, crossed by roots, shaded by stems, and held together by soil rich with microbial life. In such places, humidity stays higher, temperatures fluctuate less, and organic matter remains available. For an early arthropod trying not to dry out while also hoping to find something edible, this was excellent news. The world was no longer only exposed surface, it had seams, crevices, damp pockets, and edible leftovers. There is something wonderfully practical about the earlier stages of animal life on land. It was not all majestic tetrapods hauling themselves from the shallows while the music swelled. Much of it was tiny creatures exploring leaf litter, nibbling fungi, scraping at microbial films or feeding on decaying plants. The great terrestrial drama began in low light and close to the ground. A good portion of the first land-based animal economy was built not on hunting great prey, but on digestion, decomposition, and opportunism, which, to be fair, still describes quite a lot of life. As plant communities became denser and more complex, they created more niches. Some arthropods could feed directly on plants or spores, others could specialize on fungi, others could prey on fellow arthropods. Once prey exists, predators rarely stay away for long. Food webs on land therefore grew more layered. Detritivores, fungivores, herbivores, and predators all began filling roles that had previously not existed on the continents. Land was no longer simply habitable, it was ecologically busy. The rise in atmospheric oxygen may also have helped. Oxygen levels during the Paleozoic, though variable over time, appear to have been influenced strongly by the expansion of land plants and the burial of organic carbon. More oxygen in the air benefits terrestrial animals because air is already easier to breathe than water in many ways. Oxygen diffuses more readily in air, which means respiratory systems can work efficiently once an animal has structures that prevent its tissues from drying out and that can move oxygen into the body. Arthropods with tracheal systems and vertebrates with lungs each exploited this in their own ways. A richer oxygen atmosphere was not the only requirement for animal success on land, but it certainly did not hurt. Forests also made movement across land more practical. Bare rock, shifting sediment, and exposed surfaces are one thing. Soil, plant cover, and structurally varied terrain are another. Roots stabilize slopes. Litter softens the surface. Wetlands and floodplains become more persistent. Streams are bordered by vegetation. All this creates corridors and refuges. An animal venturing across a vegetated floodplain or through early woodland has access to shade, moisture, and cover. An animal crossing an open mineral plain has fewer such luxuries and many more opportunities to regret its choices. Arthropods were not the only ones watching these developments with evolutionary interest. Vertebrates had long flourished in water, and some lineages already possessed traits that made occasional ventures into shallow, oxygen-poor waters possible. Certain fish had lungs or lung-like structures, robust fins, and life histories tied to dynamic freshwater environments. In shallow swamps, floodplains, and vegetated waterways, the line between aquatic and terrestrial life becomes less rigid. Muddy margins, temporary pools, and oxygen-stressed water are good places for experimentation. The first vertebrates to move onto land did not do so because they had grand philosophical plans about destiny. They did so because some water bodies were difficult, some shorelines were promising, and natural selection rewards any body plan that can exploit both. By the late Devonian, tetrapod-like vertebrates were beginning to appear, descendants of lobe-finned fishes whose paired fins had become sturdy enough to support weight in shallow water or at the margins. These early forms were not immediately striding confidently through deep forest with the air of creatures who had sorted everything out. They remained strongly tied to water. Their limbs were useful, but their bodies and life cycles still reflected aquatic ancestry. Yet their emergence tells us something crucial. The land had become worth the effort for vertebrates too. And why had it become worth the effort? Because plants had transformed the setting. Vegetated margins and swampy floodplains offered food, shelter, shade, and complexity. Organic rich waters and soils supported invertebrate prey. Rooted landscapes stabilized habitats that would otherwise have been too unstable or exposed. Forests and wetlands made edges, and edges are often where major evolutionary innovations happen. The first vertebrates on land did not arrive in a vacuum. They arrived in a world prepared for them by plants. One should also notice that the animal move onto land was not only a story of big vertebrates. It was, first and foremost, a story of ecosystems. Before any famous ancestor hauled itself anywhere, the ground was already alive with smaller creatures making terrestrial life work. Soil microfauna, arthropods, decomposers, and early consumers created the first robust land food webs. In that sense, the day Earth became a world for animals was not the day a single creature took a dramatic step. It was the long interval during which plants had built enough habitat, food, and atmospheric stability for animal communities to persist and diversify on land. There is a tendency in storytelling to privilege the visible moment. The fish with limbs, the creature leaving footprints, the first obvious jaw on a riverbank. But ecosystems do not operate by cinematic logic. A vertebrate can only succeed on land if countless smaller processes are already in place. There must be oxygen to breathe, surfaces that can be crossed, prey to catch or detritus to feed on, shelter from drying, and habitats that do not vanish immediately after every weather event. Plants provided these conditions. Forests, wetlands, and soils made them persistent. Consider something as ordinary as shade. Under the canopy or even under dense low vegetation, moisture lasts longer. For an animal with a body vulnerable to dehydration, that is the difference between opportunity and disaster. Consider litter. A layer of dead plant material supports fungi, microbes, and small prey while also creating cover. Consider roots. They make burrows easier to stabilize, create cavities and complex surfaces, and help maintain soil structure. Consider oxygen. A plant-made atmosphere makes terrestrial respiration more feasible. Consider food. Living plant tissues, spores, fungal bodies, and detritus all provide entry points for different diets. The terrestrial world became usable because it became furnished. Once animals established themselves on land, their presence fed back into plant-dominated ecosystems. Small arthropods chewing plant tissues or fungal bodies affected decomposition and nutrient cycling. Burrowing or moving through soil and litter altered aeration and mixing. Predators influenced prey populations. Later, herbivory would become an even more significant force, though the earliest forests were not yet under siege by the full parade of later terrestrial appetites. Still, the relationship between plants and animals became reciprocal. Plants made land habitable. Animals began reshaping the living systems plants had built. There is also the matter of reproduction. For vertebrates, early life on land remained constrained by dependence on water. Eggs laid in water, larvae tied to aquatic conditions, and bodies not yet fully adapted to dryness meant that the first tetrapods were really inhabitants of the borderlands. They lived in the overlap between forest and swamp, stream and soil, water and air. The full liberation from water would come later, with the evolution of amniotic eggs and more fully terrestrial reproductive strategies. But again, that later success rests on this earlier stage, when plant-built habitats made amphibious existence on land viable enough to persist. The Carboniferous world that followed would see these trends expand dramatically. Vast swamp forests, abundant plant biomass, and increasingly rich terrestrial ecosystems supported growing diversity among arthropods and vertebrates alike. Some arthropods became enormous by modern standards, especially in intervals of high oxygen, giving rise to the sort of dragonfly relatives that make one very grateful for the general restraint of modern insect size. Amphibians diversified, later reptiles and other amniotes would move into drier habitats, but none of that would make sense without the earlier transformation of the continents by trees. Another thing trees gave animals was predictability. Not perfect stability, because this is Earth and it does enjoy a bit of upheaval, but more consistent habitat structure. A forest lasts longer than a film of algae on whetstone. A rooted floodplain is more persistent than a bare sediment fan after a storm. Long-lived vegetation creates long-lived environments, and long-lived environments favour evolutionary specialisation. Once a habitat persists over generations, animals can adapt to it more precisely. They can evolve body plans, feeding behaviours, and life cycles that fit specific niches. Forest floors, trunks, branches, wetlands, and riparian margins all become arenas for specialisation. The land stops being just available and starts being differentiated. That differentiation is one of the hallmarks of an animal world. Not simply that creatures are present, but that there are many ways to live. Crawlers in litter, feeders on spores, predators in damp shade, amphibious vertebrates in floodplain channels, burrowers in soft ground. Later, climbers, gliders, egg layers in drier habitats, and all the rest. Plants created the architecture, animals filled the rooms. The role of decay deserves another moment here because it is easy to overlook in favour of more glamorous evolutionary developments. Forests produce large amounts of dead matter. That dead matter accumulates, decays, feeds fungi and microbes, and becomes part of the detrital economy. Many early land animals likely depended more on this economy than on live plant grazing. Detritus is stable in a way fresh leaves are not. It is everywhere there is a forest floor. It supports whole communities. So one of the ways Earth became an animal world was by becoming, quite literally, messier. Fallen litter, rotting wood and rich soil are not just signs of an ecosystem. They are engines of one. There is also a subtle psychological trap in the way we think about this history. We often assume animals bring vitality to a landscape, and plants merely fill it in. In reality, the vitality of the first terrestrial ecosystems was rooted in plants. They made the oxygen, built the soils, regulated the water, and structured the habitats before animal diversity on land took off. If the animals later made the land noisier, faster and more dramatic, that still does not change the fact that plants had already done most of the civil engineering. Even the eventual rise of human civilization sits somewhere inside this ancient sequence, but that comes later. At this point in the story, it is enough to see how profound the threshold was. A planet that had once reserved most of its animal complexity for the sea now had functioning terrestrial food webs. The continents supported not only plants, fungi and microbes, but creatures that moved through soil, fed in the litter, hunted one another, and explored the margins between water and forest. Earth had become a place where animals could live above the tide line without treating the experience as a temporary emergency. And once that happened, evolution had more room to work than ever before. New diets could emerge, new body plans could be tested, new respiratory strategies, skin structures, eggs, limbs and senses could evolve under the selective pressures of terrestrial life. The forested land was not simply a new location, it was a new set of opportunities and constraints. It rewarded some experiments and punished others. It offered vast new territory, but demanded that organisms solve dryness, gravity, locomotion, and reproduction in fresh ways. Animals would spend the next hundreds of millions of years answering those demands. What makes this moment especially important is that it marks the beginning of the world that would eventually include us, though at this stage in a very indirect and deeply unflattering ancestral sense. Long before mammals, before birds, before flowers, before grasslands and orchards and all the rest, there had to be this transition in which the land first became broadly usable for animals. Trees and forests did not simply make nice scenery for later life. They made later life possible by producing the conditions in which terrestrial ecosystems could expand and stabilize. So the real achievement of the first forests was not only that they changed the atmosphere or cooled the planet or built soil, remarkable though all of that was, it was that they made the continents capable of supporting communities of animals, from the tiniest soil dwellers to the early vertebrates testing the world beyond water. Once animals followed plants onto land in earnest, Earth was no longer just a greener planet. It was a more populated, more interactive, more ecologically layered one. And from that point on, every later land ecosystem, every woodland, swamp, desert margin, grassland edge, and eventually every field, farm, town and city would in some way rest on the groundwork laid by those first ancient forests that turned bare stone into a place where feet, claws, and bodies could finally belong. By the time ancient forests had thickened across the land, cooled the climate, stabilized rivers, and made the continents livable for animals, something even larger had quietly taken shape. Earth had become the kind of planet on which a long future could unfold. Not a future aimed at us, because evolution does not work from a script and the Devonian did not sit around making arrangements for primates with laptops, but a future in which creatures like us could eventually exist at all. That is the key point here. The first forests did not produce humanity in any direct or tidy sense. What they did was much more important. They built the environmental foundation on which all later terrestrial complexity depended, and that foundation runs straight beneath our lives even now. It is easy to underestimate just how much of our world rests on things forests made possible long before there were mammals, birds, flowers, or anything resembling civilization. We tend to think of human history as beginning with cities, farming, writing, and the wheel, perhaps followed closely by the invention of worrying about taxes. But those are very recent surface details. Beneath them lies a deeper dependence. We are creatures of oxygen-rich air, moderated climates, structured soils, stable river systems, and terrestrial food webs of enormous complexity. None of those arrived as default features of a rocky planet. They were built over deep time, and forests were among the chief builders. Take soil, to begin with. Because it's difficult to talk about civilization without eventually talking about dirt, however unromantic that may seem. Soil is one of the quiet preconditions of almost everything humans have ever done on land. Agriculture acquires it. Grasslands and forests require it. Most terrestrial ecosystems require some version of it. And soil in the rich biologically active sense is not just ground up rock. It is an ancient collaboration between plants, roots, fungi, microbes, climate, water, and time. The earliest forests helped deepen and stabilize soils on a scale the planet had not seen before. Their roots broke into rock, their litter fed decomposition, their fungal partnerships moved nutrients, and their constant turnover of biomass thickened the living skin of the continents. By doing so, they made the land productive enough to support everything that followed, from Carboniferous swamps to Cretaceous woodlands to Neolithic farms. There is a pleasingly humbling detail in that. Human civilization likes to congratulate itself on its foundations, and some of those foundations are certainly impressive in a local, architectural sense. Stone walls, irrigation canals, roads, and bridges are all well and good, but the deepest foundation of civilization is topsoil, and topsoil is, in significant part, a botanical achievement. Forests and other plant systems made the continents capable of holding nutrients, storing moisture, and supporting complex food webs. Long before anyone planted wheat or rice, forests were busy doing the very slow work that would one day make fields possible. Water too belongs in this story. Civilizations do not simply need land, they need water that arrives in somewhat reliable ways, flows through landscapes in somewhat manageable channels, and does not carry the entire hillside into the river every time it rains with enthusiasm. Ancient forests changed how water moved across the continents. They slowed runoff, increased infiltration, stabilized riverbanks, and helped create floodplains and wetlands with more persistent structure. In doing so, they made the hydrology of the land more regulated and in many places more productive. Later ecosystems and eventually human societies inherited that shaped landscape. Our rivers are not merely geological accidents. They are descendants of systems long modified by vegetation. And rivers matter more than we tend to notice. They determine where sediments collect, where nutrients are concentrated, where deltas form, where wetlands persist, and where fertile land develops. Human settlements have clustered around rivers for obvious reasons: water, transport, food, and fertile floodplains. But those river systems themselves were profoundly influenced by ancient plant colonization. Once forests rooted the land and altered runoff, rivers began behaving differently. Meanders became more common in vegetated settings. Floodplains trapped fine sediments more effectively. Banks became stronger. Entire drainage systems acquired patterns that would echo through later geological ages. In a very real sense, forests helped prepare the stage upon which future civilizations would prefer to place themselves. Then there is the atmosphere. We are so used to breathing oxygen that it rarely occurs to us what a remarkable thing an oxygen-rich atmosphere actually is. It is not a default property of rocky planets. It is a biospheric achievement, one first driven by photosynthetic microbes and then shaped further by the expansion of plants on land. Ancient forests contributed to the long-term balance of oxygen by producing large amounts of biomass and by helping bury some of the carbon that would otherwise have been rapidly returned to the air. Over geologic time, that matters. A more oxygen-rich atmosphere supports more active terrestrial life, more intense metabolisms, and a broader range of ecological possibilities. It is part of the reason the land became such a rich arena for animals and much later for us. It is worth emphasizing that none of this was done for our benefit. The forest did not cool the climate because they had concerns about future agricultural zones. They did not enrich soils because they hoped one day to support olive groves, orchards, or someone trying unsuccessfully to grow tomatoes in poor conditions. They were simply successful organisms reshaping the world as a byproduct of living in it. But that is how the largest foundations are often laid in nature, not through intention, but through consequence. A tree grows, roots, dies, sheds, and spreads. Repeat that enough times over enough land, and a planet changes category. Ancient forests also laid the groundwork for us by building complexity into terrestrial ecosystems. Before forests, the continents were far less layered as habitats. There were fewer niches, fewer food webs, fewer opportunities for specialization. Forests created vertical structure, litter-rich ground layers, humid refuges, decaying wood, root zones, and shaded waterways. These became stages for the diversification of animals, fungi, and microbes. Arthropods, amphibians, reptiles, later seed plants, later mammals, all unfolded within terrestrial worlds whose complexity had already been amplified by forests. We did not emerge onto a blank map. We emerged into a biosphere already thick with inherited relationships. That idea of inheritance is useful because it keeps us from slipping into the fantasy that human civilization sprang from human cleverness alone. Cleverness helped, certainly. One should not discount fire, language, memory, tools, or the deeply suspicious amount of confidence our species has shown in moving heavy stones around. But cleverness without a supportive planet goes nowhere. A species needs fertile land, stable water cycles, breathable air, moderated climates and ecologies productive enough to support large animal populations and eventually farming. Ancient forests helped establish all of those conditions. Even the energy history of civilization carries the fingerprints of ancient forests. Much later, especially in Carboniferous and Permian landscapes, enormous quantities of plant material accumulated, some of it in waterlogged conditions that slowed decomposition and favoured burial. Over still longer stretches of geologic time, some of those buried plant remains became coal. Coal, which is in essence ancient sunlight captured by plants and compressed by the earth, would eventually help power the Industrial Revolution. That is a complicated and morally mixed inheritance, to put it mildly, but it is part of the story. Humans would one day dig up ancient forests, burn them, and use the released carbon to run engines, build industries, and alter the climate in the opposite direction from the one those forests had once helped steer. There is a certain bleak irony in that. Plants spent millions of years drawing carbon down, building soils and helping regulate the planet into a habitable state for complex terrestrial life. Then much later, one very inventive species began excavating the compressed remains of old plant worlds and returning that carbon to the atmosphere in a geological instant. It is almost enough to make one apologise to a tree, though of course it would remain politely silent about the whole business. Still, before that modern turn, forests continued to shape the conditions under which our lineage could eventually emerge. Mammals did not evolve in a vacuum. Primates did not evolve in a vacuum. Even the spread of flowering plants and grasslands later on took place in a terrestrial biosphere already transformed by earlier forest revolutions. Deep soils, weathered continents, oxygen-rich air, terrestrial animal food webs, and plant-driven climate feedbacks were all part of the inheritance passed forward through time. We arrived very late to an old and heavily prepared world. There is also the matter of habitability in the broad sense. When scientists talk about habitable planets, the phrase often refers to the possibility of liquid water and tolerable temperatures. That is a useful starting point, but on Earth the richer form of habitability was built gradually by life itself. Forests helped convert a merely inhabitable world into one that was robustly livable for large, complex terrestrial ecosystems. They softened extremes in local climates, stabilised landscapes, and made nutrient cycling more effective. They increased the carrying capacity of the continents, so when we speak of ancient forests laying the groundwork for us, we are not being sentimental. We are describing a real planetary upgrade. Food webs are part of that upgrade too. No human society, however urban or technological, floats free of biology. Our food ultimately comes from photosynthesis, soils, water, and stable ecological relations, whether directly through crops or indirectly through animals and fisheries supported by broader ecosystems. Ancient forests helped build the terrestrial branch of that system by making land productive and habitable at scale. They were among the great enablers of the food-producing Earth. Even where modern agriculture has replaced forests with fields, the underlying conditions that make those fields possible were often shaped by long plant histories before any plough ever appeared. And then there is climate stability, or at least relative stability. The Earth has never been still, and it would be unwise to imagine that forests solved climate into a neat permanent answer. But they did become central participants in the regulation of carbon dioxide, hydrology, and atmospheric chemistry. That means later Earth, including the ages in which humans evolved and spread, inherited a planet whose climate system had long been coupled to vegetation. Forests store carbon. They affect rainfall. They influence albedo, evapotranspiration, and regional weather. They moderate extremes in ways that are easy to overlook when they are present and alarmingly obvious when they are gone. Human civilization developed during a period of relatively stable climate by geological standards, and although many factors contributed to that stability, the long partnership between vegetation and atmosphere is among the most important. One can see this inheritance almost everywhere. The very landscapes we think of as natural backdrops to human history are often products of ancient vegetative engineering. Valleys with deep soils, river plains, forest margins, wetland basins, and even uplands that remain intact rather than simply eroding to pieces all bear the marks of long plant occupation. Forests are not an optional decorative overlay on the real planet beneath. They are part of how the real planet beneath came to function. That becomes especially clear when we imagine the opposite. Without the rise of terrestrial plants and forests, what would the continents look like? They would be rockier, less fertile, less structured, less oxygen-rich above, less stable hydrologically, and far poorer in terrestrial habitat. Animal life on land would be sparse or absent. There would be no complex soils, no forest floors, no rich terrestrial food webs, no lush floodplains, no great storehouse of buried plant carbon, and almost certainly no route to anything like human civilization. In that sense, forests do not merely support us in the present. They are part of the reason the present exists at all. There is also something worth saying about time here. Human history feels long to us because our memories and institutions are short compared with geological processes. 1,000 years seems vast. 10,000 years feels almost mythic. But the groundwork forests laid was measured not in millennia, but in tens and hundreds of millions of years. Soil formation, atmospheric shifts, animal diversification, the deep weathering of continents, the burial of carbon, the restructuring of river systems, all of it unfolded with a patience so extreme it is hard to imagine. Yet that patience is part of what made the result so durable. Forests did not simply make a change. They built systems that persisted, evolved, and carried their influence forward through ages. When our own species finally appears much later, we enter a world already deeply conditioned by this older botanical labour. Early humans moved through landscapes shaped by plants. They depended on wood for fire, shelter, and tools. They relied on rivers stabilised by vegetation, animals sustained by plant-based ecosystems, and climates moderated by long-established carbon cycles. Later, agricultural societies would clear forests even as they depended on forest-made soils and watersheds. Civilizations would rise in places where plant-shaped hydrology and fertility allowed large populations to gather. Even our myths and symbols are full of trees, groves, sacred woods, orchards, and forests, which feels only fair given how much we owe them. And yet we often speak of forests today as though they were resources added to a human world rather than systems foundational to it. We talk about timber, land use, carbon offsets, watershed services, recreation, biodiversity value, scenic protection, and all the familiar categories by which modern societies reduce living systems to line items they hope sound responsible. Those categories are not useless, but they are too small. Forests are older and more important than any one policy language can capture. They are not just assets. They are infrastructure inherited from deep time. The old forests laid the groundwork for us in another sense too. They demonstrated what living systems can do to a planet. They turned bare land into soil, shifted the atmosphere, shaped climate, reorganized rivers, and made terrestrial ecosystems possible. That means the biosphere is not a passenger. It is an active force. Humans, as a technological species, have now become another active force, but unlike forests, we tend to change things very quickly, and not always with the quiet long-term stability of the systems we disrupt. If forests show what biological engineering can build, modern civilization is busy showing what careless engineering can undo. That is why the ancient story matters now. It is not merely an interesting preface to our existence. It is a warning disguised as a success story. The same forests that laid the groundwork for us also reveal how deeply the planet depends on living systems to regulate itself. Remove those systems, and the ground does not simply remain the same with fewer trees on it. The water cycle shifts, soil erodes, carbon returns to the atmosphere, rivers change, coastal systems suffer, habitat fragments, climate becomes less stable. In short, the foundation starts to crack. For all our technology, we still live inside conditions forests helped create. We breathe their kind of air, we depend on their sort of soil, we inherit river systems and climates that were shaped by their long presence. Even our cities, which can look like triumphs of concrete over chlorophyll, rest on food, water, materials, and atmospheric stability that ultimately trace back to plant-made Earth. Ancient forests laid the groundwork for us not because they predicted us, but because they built a world rich and stable enough that beings like us could arise and, for a while at least, thrive. And that is where the story begins to turn in a more uncomfortable direction, because once you understand forests as planetary engineers rather than background scenery, it becomes much harder to look calmly at what we are doing to them now. And this is where the story stops feeling comfortably ancient and starts feeling uncomfortably close to home. For most of the journey, we have been looking backward, watching plants creep onto bare stone, learning how to survive in air, working with fungi, inventing soil, building forests, pulling carbon out of the sky, cooling the planet, reshaping rivers, feeding oceans, and making the land livable for animals. All of that can feel safely distant, the sort of thing one can admire from the calm of a pillow in a dim room, filed under fascinating events from a world so old it barely seems connected to tomorrow morning. But it is connected, very directly, because the same kinds of systems that helped create the habitable Earth are still operating now, and we are dismantling them at a speed the deep past almost never saw. Forests are often described as habitats, resources, landscapes, carbon sinks, or biodiversity hotspots. All of those descriptions are true, but they are too small on their own. A forest is not just a collection of trees standing in a place where there happens to be some wildlife. It is a working piece of planetary infrastructure. It stores carbon above and below ground. It pumps water into the atmosphere through transpiration. It cools the land surface. It helps form clouds and influences rainfall. It stabilizes slopes and riverbanks. It holds soil in place. It slows floods. It creates habitat structure for countless organisms. It regulates nutrient movement. It changes the chemistry of air and water. In practical terms, a forest is closer to a life support system than a scenic background. That is why cutting one down has consequences beyond the obvious loss of trunks and leaves. When a forest is removed, carbon that was stored in wood and soil begins returning to the atmosphere. Water stops being recycled in the same way. The ground heats more quickly in sunlight. Rain strikes the surface more directly. Soil erodes more easily. Rivers often become flashier, muddier, and less stable. Local humidity can drop. Biodiversity falls. In many places, fires become more likely or more intense. These are not side issues. They are signs that the machinery is being taken apart. One of the most important things forests do, especially large, old and continuous forests, is move water. This is easy to overlook because we tend to think of water cycling as something controlled by weather systems and oceans, with forests merely receiving rain that was already going to fall. But forests are not passive umbrellas. They actively participate in making and redistributing moisture. Trees draw water from the ground and release it through their leaves. Enough trees doing this over large areas can influence humidity, cloud formation, and rainfall patterns downwind. In some regions, large forests help generate part of the rain that keeps both the forest itself and surrounding agricultural areas functioning. Remove enough forest and that recycling weakens. The result can be hotter, drier conditions, not only inside the cleared zone but across broader landscapes. This is one reason deforestation is so disruptive in tropical regions. Tropical forests do not just store carbon. They also help maintain the hydrological conditions under which they and many nearby human systems can continue to exist. When these forests are fragmented or removed, the land often becomes warmer and drier. Dry seasons can lengthen. Fire can move into places that once resisted it. Regrowth becomes harder. In the worst cases, a forest can begin losing the very conditions that made it a forest, which is a deeply troubling feedback loop. It is rather like removing parts of an air conditioner during a heat wave and then acting surprised when the room grows more difficult to live in. The same broad principle applies in temperate and boreal forests as well, though the details differ. Forests moderate local climates. They reduce extremes at the ground. They hold snow differently. They protect watersheds. They maintain soil structure. They shape stream temperatures and flow patterns. A forested catchment and a heavily cleared one do not behave the same after heavy rain. The forested one usually absorbs more, slows more, filters more, and sends water onward in a steadier way. Remove the trees and the system becomes harsher and less buffered. Flood peaks can increase. Sediment loads rise. Water quality drops. Aquatic habitats suffer. Towns downstream discover that the comfort of having trees uphill was not sentimental after all. Soil may be the most quietly tragic part of all this, because once lost, it is not quickly replaced. Forests protect soil in multiple ways. Their roots bind it. Their litter cushions it from rain impact. Their canopy reduces the force with which water hits the surface. Their biology helps build soil structure, allowing water to soak in rather than run off in a hurry. When forests are cleared, especially carelessly or repeatedly, soil becomes vulnerable. Heavy rain can strip it away. Wind can carry it off. Sun can dry and harden it. Nutrients can be leached faster than they are replaced. What took centuries or millennia to build can be degraded in years. And soil loss is not only a problem for forests themselves. It is a problem for farms, rivers, fisheries, reservoirs, roads, and settlements. Once sediment starts moving, it does not politely stop at the edge of the former forest. It enters streams, clogs channels, muddies water, smothers aquatic habitats, fills dams and irrigation works, and lowers the long-term productivity of the land. In that sense, deforestation often behaves like a slow transfer of wealth from the future to the present. One gets quick timber, quick land conversion, quick extraction, and later receives floods, exhausted fields, fire risk, and the general bill for undoing a stabilizing system. There is also the carbon problem, which by now is impossible to ignore unless one has made a full-time hobby of pretending thermodynamics is a matter of opinion. Forests store vast amounts of carbon in biomass and soils. Old forests in particular can hold enormous carbon stocks accumulated over long periods. When they are cut, burned or degraded, some of that carbon returns to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Even if land is later replanted, a newly planted forest is not the same as the one it replaced. It may take decades or centuries to rebuild comparable carbon stores, and in some cases, under warmer and drier future climates, the original level may never fully return. We are therefore not merely changing scenery when we remove forests. We are changing the balance of atmospheric carbon in a way that pushes the climate in the opposite direction from the one ancient forests once helped establish. This is the unsettling mirror image of the Devonian story. The first trees helped draw down carbon dioxide and cool the planet over geologic time. Modern deforestation, combined with fossil fuel burning, is helping send carbon back upward on a human timescale. Ancient forests helped create a world in which large, stable terrestrial ecosystems could persist. We are now testing how much of that inherited stability can be removed before the system starts behaving in uglier and less predictable ways. It is not an experiment anyone sensible would have designed, and yet we're conducting it with remarkable commitment. Biodiversity adds another layer to this. Forests are not only regulators of climate and water, they are homes, complex ones. A mature forest contains niches from the canopy to the understory, to the bark, to the roots, to the litter, to the soil itself. Remove the forest and you do not simply remove one kind of habitat. You erase an entire vertical and horizontal arrangement of living space. Birds lose nesting sites, mammals lose cover and food, insects lose host plants and microclimates, fungi lose partners, stream species lose shade and cooler water. The result is not just fewer species in a sentimental sense. It is a thinning of the relationships that keep ecosystems functional. And functional ecosystems matter to people whether we notice them or not. Pollination, pest control, water filtration, climate moderation, flood buffering, fishery support and disease regulation all depend in part on intact ecological systems. A forest is often far more useful standing and functioning than it is as a short-lived burst of cleared land followed by gradual decline. But because the benefits of intact forests are often distributed, long-term and shared, while the profits of clearing can be immediate and concentrated, human decision-making has a habit of choosing the loud short-term reward over the quieter long-term stability. This is not exactly one of our more charming species traits. What makes the present situation especially serious is scale. Forest loss has happened throughout history in many places, and some landscapes can recover if pressure is reduced and enough ecological memory remains in the system. But extensive, repeated and fragmented clearing across large regions can push whole forest systems toward different states. A moist, continuous forest can become a patchwork. A patchwork can become drier and more fire-prone. Once fires become common in a system not adapted to frequent burning, recovery becomes harder. Invasive species may move in, soils degrade, water cycles weaken, regeneration slows. The old forest system, with all its deep-rooted stability, becomes less likely to return. This is one reason old growth and primary forests matter so much. A mature forest is not simply a younger forest that has been standing around longer. It is a more complex system, often with deeper soils, larger carbon stores, older fungal networks, more varied structure, and species composition shaped over long periods. Old forests hold history in their living arrangement. Remove them, and one loses not only biomass but time. Planting seedlings is good, and in many places badly needed, but one should not confuse a plantation or young regrowth with the full functional depth of an old forest. A newly planted line of trees can be useful. It is not, however, the same thing as rebuilding millions of subtle interactions overnight. There is also a practical issue that human societies keep rediscovering in slightly more expensive ways than one would hope. When forests are lost upstream, people downstream often pay. Water treatment becomes harder. Flooding worsens. Dry season flows may become less reliable. Reservoirs silt up faster. Croplands suffer from erosion or altered rainfall. Cities get hotter. Coastal systems receive heavier nutrient and sediment loads. Fisheries can decline. Insurance costs rise. Infrastructure takes damage. In other words, what looks like a rural land use decision is often, in reality, regional system sabotage. The phrase planetary engineers is not a metaphor stretched beyond usefulness. Forests really do engineer conditions at scales from the root zone to the atmosphere. They are among the few living systems capable of changing climate, hydrology, and biogeochemistry in ways visible from space and legible in the rock record. They have done it before. The evidence is written all through Earth history, which means there is something particularly reckless about cutting them down while still depending on the very systems they regulate. It is the equivalent of taking apart the plumbing in a house because the pipes are not directly producing quarterly profit, and yet it would be too simple to frame this as humans versus trees in some cartoon moral universe. People cut forests for reasons that are often tied to real pressures: fuel, timber, farmland, cattle pasture, mining access, roads, economic development, debt and inequality. Many communities living near forests have long used them sustainably and know perfectly well what intact forest means for water, soil and daily survival. The largest drivers of destructive loss are often broader systems of demand, governance failure, weak land rights, short-term extraction, and markets far away from the felled tree. So the issue is not that humanity in the abstract woke up one day with a personal grudge against photosynthesis. The issue is that modern economies are very good at converting long-term ecological stability into short-term material gain while hiding the cost in the future. Still, one should not let structural explanation become an excuse for passivity. Forest protection works when it is taken seriously. Indigenous land stewardship, legal protections, restoration of degraded landscapes, fire management, watershed conservation, better agricultural planning, reduced demand for products linked to deforestation, and stronger enforcement can all make a real difference. Regrowth can recover meaningful carbon, habitat and hydrological function over time. Degraded lands can be restored, river margins can be replanted, fragmented corridors can be reconnected. None of this is effortless, and none of it fully substitutes for keeping intact forests standing in the first place. But it matters. There is a useful distinction here between trees and forests. Planting trees is good, protecting forests is better. A line of saplings may look hopeful, and often it is, but a forest is not defined only by the presence of trunks. It is defined by relationships. Soil communities, fungi, canopy structure, dead wood, root systems, moisture patterns, pollinators, seed dispersers, predators, shade, litter, and time all matter. Restoration has to think in those terms if it wants to rebuild function rather than simply produce a flattering aerial photograph. One of the more peculiar features of modern life is that many people now experience forests primarily as places to visit, rather than systems that make everyday life possible. They're associated with walks, trails, cabins, birdsong, perhaps an overconfident squirrel and a mildly disappointing map. All of that is pleasant enough, but it can hide the deeper reality. The forest is not only where one goes to feel calmer on a Sunday afternoon. It is one of the reasons there is drinkable water, arable soil, moderated heat, and a climate that has not yet fully lost patience with us. That is a slightly different level of importance, and there is, I think, a strange emotional mismatch in how we talk about this. The facts are large, but the language often becomes either dry and technical or melodramatic and useless. So perhaps it helps to say it plainly. Forests help to make the world we depend on. They built soils. They shaped rivers, they cooled the planet, they helped raise oxygen, they created habitat for animals and very indirectly conditions for us. We're now removing them in ways that destabilize those same systems. That is not only sad, it is foolish in a very practical sense. If one wanted a final lesson from the first trees, it might be this: life can transform a planet, but transformation does not stop being powerful just because it becomes familiar. Ancient forests changed Earth so thoroughly that we now mistake many of their achievements for background conditions. We think breathable air, stable soil, moderated watersheds, and forest-fed rain are simply how a habitable world works. In truth, they are how this habitable world came to work, thanks in no small part to forests. Remove enough of them, and those conditions begin to look less like guarantees and more like gifts we failed to understand in time. So as we come to the end of this long walk from bare stone to living continents, it is worth remembering what the first trees really were. Not ornaments, not scenery, not optional extras in the margins of Earth history. They were planetary engineers, and their descendants still are. Every standing forest is part of an ancient system that once turned a rocky world into a habitable one. Every felled forest is a piece of that system taken apart. And if the old story teaches anything, it is that forests have always had the power to change the planet. The only real question now is whether we will let them keep doing the work that made our world possible, or whether we will continue undoing it until the loss becomes too obvious, too costly, and too late to mistake for anything as simple as cutting down trees.